Guys, we are going to start in 2 minutes. So grab some wine, go to the restroom if you need to, just here, get some water, and yeah, we will pick up very, very soon. Good. Okay. I like that. Yeah. All right, hi guys, I'm just going to start. I see that there are so many conversations ongoing. Maybe it's difficult to know when to transition to the crowd event without that. A warmest welcome to you guys. This is such a pleasure to be hosting this is Interintellect 4th seasonal festival. I started this exactly a year ago in this very location, kind of thinking about how to shape an event series where we can investigate what the good life is. And I know you've been to the future of publishing and you're now at the Ideas of Power event and wondering maybe how that relates to good life. I think that a good life is some experience that you can share with other people and where you feel fully knowledgeable and in control of how that might happen. One great mystery of our times is how power works, what it is. Wherever you look on the internet, whichever friend of yours you dig up for a great conversation, they will say something completely different. So I thought, what if we actually brought people together, very experienced, very with high expertise in different walks of life, and see what they see. So, I mean, despite the colors I'm wearing, wink, wink, Interintellect does not do political events. This is not a political event. We are a completely apolitical platform. But even in our little ivory tower where we investigate the great questions of life, philosophy, science, society, we have to somehow respond to the world around us. And today we will hear about the question of power from 3 different genres or 3 different angles. The first panel will be just starting, hosted by Isabella Burton, theologian, novelist, and overall polyhistor. Ganz, my friend, will be unpopularly or popularly on the panel to talk about what famous populist politicians might get away with and whether it's we who let them. And Sonnevend, whose new book Charm has just come out and who's an expert in photographic memory and the workings of fame, will look at how social media and new ways of being famous might shape what people can achieve through their political careers and how much we as audience might be accountable for this. We will transition right into the next panel. If you need to take a break, please feel free to do that on your own time. The audience is not in the live stream, so you're welcome to move around. The second panel will look at education. I know that a lot of you here are educators or have some kind of academic affiliation, so I'm sure you will not take it personally at all. We created a beautiful panel led by Skye Cleary, philosopher, author, expert in mid-20th century French shenanigans that I know American academia doesn't care about at all these days. And we will have a psychologist, Barry Kaufman, on the panel, as well as a sociologist, Musa. So all the isms will be on the panel, and we will see who wins. Then we will take a short break. It's really short, so we will try to keep on time. And then we will come back to the key panel of this event, the so-called God panel, where we'll talk about secular power and divine power, or whether religiosity plays in some ways as a counterbalance to worldly power, or is it always captured by worldly power itself? We have Shadi Hamid here, who will be on our panel, and Jennifer Frey, and Rebecca Lau, our friend, political philosopher, will be moderating. A little aside, like partly this event was inspired by Shadi's upcoming book on power, which is a first for Interintellect. We've never before shaped an event around a book that has not yet been published or even fully written. So maybe this is also some kind of a user research, and kind of beyond that. At the end, the roundtable is called "On Power," and it will be I will be leading that, and it will be greatly shaped around what we come up with during the three panels. There will be no Q&As, and you can interject if there is something really on your chest. But the questions will be during the roundtable. This is really for us to bring together the three panels and the moderators who are themselves experts in these topics, but to hear from you. Interintellect is about you and your voices. And so I really want us to conclude this event in the end over wine and amazing snacks, that you felt heard and that you could reflect and express your views in a safe environment where we're actually curious about the very complicated things that might come up during the conversation. So this is my brief intro, and you will not hear from me again until the roundtable. Enjoy the first panel with our lovely friends, and I was.
So I am delighted to be here to talk to you with both of you and to all of you and with all of you in various permutations about power and populism and the internet and authoritarianism and charm and charisma and magic, but we'll get to that. So for starters, an introduction. So well, they're both to my left, but to my immediate left is John Ganz. John is the author of When the Clock Broke, Con Men, Conspiracists. Are we cheering for John, for the book, for Con Men specifically? We can say Conspiracists and How America Cracked Up in the Early 1990s. John also writes the widely acclaimed Unpopular Front newsletter for Substack. His work has appeared in the Washington Post, Art Forum, The New Statesman, and other publications. To my further left is Julia Sonnevend, Associate Professor of Sociology and Communications at the New School for Social Research in New York City. She's a sociologist of culture and media, focusing on the events, icons, symbols, and charismatic personalities of public life. Sonnevend is the author most recently of Charm, How Magnetic Personalities Shape Global Thoughts from Princeton University Press, as well as Stories Without Borders, The Berlin Wall, and the Making of a Global Iconic Event, and is the co-editor of Education and Social Media Toward a Digital Future. So before I ask you sort of more individual questions, I do want to get your read on one sort of meta question. And that is, in 2024, and let's say the 2020s more broadly, there's been a lot of talk about the politics of vibes, the idea that there is something distinct about our political era, perhaps the post-internet political era, perhaps something specifically about the post-Trump era, where vibes are a kind of currency. How accurate do you think that statement is? Does it need to be qualified in any particular way? Or is this just the state of what it means to be politics, that politics are always a little bit about vibes? So I'd love to hear from whichever of you wants to start, and if no one immediately does, I will just pick someone.
Okay, you want to go first?
Okay, I can
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
politics is inherently about vibes. It has always been the case. I don't think that we can claim, I mean, at least I won't claim that this is a brand new era in which we, invented vibes. But there is something about the idea that there is a different media environment in which you continuously receive visual and textual information about politicians. And you feel like in some ways or another, you are in the same space with them. You see them cooking or going into the donut shop and not, hear about it the next day, but sort of immediately. And at least there is the illusion that you can also talk back. And that creates an environment in which maybe we recognize vibes a bit more than we used to, but it's not the case that we invented them suddenly in 2024. What do you think, John?
I think, well, first of all, I think one of the reasons why politics is so interesting is that it covers such a vast range of human behavior and conduct. I mean, it can be extremely high-minded about first principles and philosophical ideas of how you think a society should be run, but in practice, it could be as stupid as not liking the way somebody looks, and that's just a part of it. So I think in the actual practice of politics, feelings, affects, general dislike of people for reasons that are not rational, or you have to look for reasons a little deeper than at face value, are always going to be a part of it. Do I think we if I understand you correctly, is there less giving and taking of reasons and more emotionality in politics, or more things are vaguer? People, I don't know. I don't think that's necessary. I think we're absolutely more aware of it because there's more sources of media. But I think, rhetoric has always been a part of democratic politics and an appeal to public opinion, and that's not pure reason. That includes appeals to people's emotions, but I do believe there's technology now that makes it both easier to make those sorts of appeals, where it used to take a lot of labor, and it's also easy to see the results, or maybe think we see the results of those kinds of appeals to emotion. So I think we just have more vibe machines. That sounds stupid, but I think that, the feeling and emotionality has always been a part of political appeals and political life.
So before I get to the next question, if I just want to understand something, Julia, when you talk about, sort of, you say politics has always been about vibes to some extent, do you mean specifically sort of democracy or politics more broadly? And do you want to I'd love to hear clarification on that before we go forward.
Well, I did grow up in a communist country, so I can speak a little bit about that. No, I mean, there are vibes in other systems too, and I would probably agree. And those of you who experienced other political systems as well. But a broader way to answer your question, I think, is about magic and non-rationality. I think we are much less rational than we imagine ourselves to be. There is a tendency, that we think that we weigh facts, there is objective deliberation, and we come to a conclusion. But no, we are part of political tribes, we are part of identities. And what we see, at least in media research, increasingly proven, even through quantitative studies, that these tribal identities trump other considerations. So it's not the case that people are not exposed to facts or contrasting opinions. They are exposed to them. They filter them differently through their pre-existing ideologies and identities and tribal connections. And that, I think, is an interesting component of politics. Again, not something that we have never had beforehand, but I think it has become more salient through new technologies and some other changes, part of which we can understand better if we read John's book.
Thank you. Well, I have one. Can we just? Yeah. I think one thing I will say is that I do believe there's a growth in political identities that are not necessarily connected to concrete life worlds of people. They learn through the internet historical periods or things about other countries, and this appeals to them, and they create a political identity that's, this has always happened to a certain extent. There's a romanticism of politics, there's feelings of solidarity with other people, and in the 19th century you had all kinds of other countries' national struggles appealing to people, you know, but I think there's a lot of political identities are formed that are not necessarily about what people's direct political issues are, but what they consume through media and what they consume through art. I think there's probably more of that. I think there's just more life experience that happens in that mediated. So in the sense that that's politics of vibes, if you want to call it that, then yeah, I think that there's an acceleration of that.
So, you know, your Twitter, someone who gets really into like bringing back the Habsburgs, for
Yeah.
example,
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
perhaps not the same thing as a Habsburgs. in the 19th century.
Right, or someone
It is a
who,
kind of-
yeah, someone who learns, like, sees pictures about North Korea and decides that's going to be their personality. It's a lot different from somebody who actually, you know, lives in North Korea or wherever. Yeah.
So while we're on the subject of your book, John, which has has now been recommended by Julia, which I also read and enjoyed. And
Oh, thank you
continued
so
to
much.
read.
Don't stop.
So- You said is, or one of them, let's say, is why the loss, and this is, I'm quoting you, why the loss of faith in the old order has registered and intensified anti-egalitarianism rather than a renewed egalitarianism, ellipsis, it's a long quote,
Mhm.
and why discontent with the distribution of wealth and power has fostered closer popularly identification with, among other, capitalists.
Yeah.
So for those, you know, everyone obviously should have read your book beforehand, but for those that didn't, what is your answer to that?
Okay, well, I should say that, you know, that's a part of the book where I do propose sort of why the book remains relevant, but my book is about the early 1990s. I would say, so I approach this, I'm like, I wouldn't say exactly Marxist, but Marxism influences my thinking about history and society. And the big problem for Marxists always are reason why our system doesn't quite work, we're always fiddling around with it, is, well, there's an enormous amount of social disorganization, social conflict that's created by capitalism being a competitive society and being an unstable society that has, you know, periodic booms and busts, and, you know, has, you know, employment structures change, industries appear, disappear, political coalitions appear. And the question always is, well, why doesn't that lead people to immediately recognize that, well, we should have a different social organization and do socialism? So the Marxists are always trying to figure out, well, why doesn't that spontaneously happen? And I guess the answer is, you know, what happens is, you know, classically, things that form that are kind of like socialisms of fools. Like the classic thing of anti-Semitism is the socialism, right? It has a certain picture of society, of social conflict, a certain picture of who's responsible for it, a certain picture of social community and wholeness that would happen if those people weren't there. And like, that's the classic socialism fools. But there are other, like, I would call them socialisms of fools, which are project a society that solves some of the problems of capitalism, not necessarily identifying capitalism as such as the issue, but let's say gravitates to certain types of business leaders or certain forms of capitalism as being more wholesome, more productive, more socially cohesive than others, and certain forms of leadership than others. The other side of that is, I think there is a tendency that people don't necessarily see social conflict and say, well, the answer to this is to form some new solidaristic bonds with people and get rid of social conflicts, and saying, well, social conflicts are inherent. Let's win, you know, and let's be part of the winning team. And this guy apparently seems like he knows what he's doing, or this group is taking from us. So we're going to, you know, treat politics as social conflict, where we're going to, which is zero sum, and we're going to, you know, be a part of a political movement that promises to reward us and to punish the people that we think are taking from us, or, you know, holding back the social cohesion that we miss, and so on and so forth. So that's like the long-winded answer I'll get to it, is that, you know, it doesn't just, people's recognition of social conflict and social fragmentation spits out a lot of different political responses.
So I do want to go back to your book eventually, but
Okay.
first I want to talk to Julia a little bit about hers.
Yeah.
So Julia, what struck by your book is you started with, among other things, Max Weber's, sociologist Max Weber's definition of charisma. And your book ultimately then goes into discussion of charm. And I'm wondering, as you frame sort of what charm is for us, what is the relationship of charm as you understand it to perhaps classical definitions of charisma as a political force?
We've been talking a little bit about this.
Yeah,
before,
really
right?
interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. So charisma has religious origins, as you know, coming from divine gifts. And then in the early 20th century, Max Weber, a German sociologist, moved it out from the religious context to the sect early on and described it as a key feature of political leadership. He did that before the rise of Adolf Hitler. He did that before, obviously, the invention of television and so on. So very different political time. But it's still the foundational theory of charisma. There's a lot of innovation in between, but people do refer back to him. So I found that interesting and problematic, since it's a radically different environment in which we live. And I think we see personal magnetism as being powerful today, but a different version. So charisma was built on distance from audiences. You think of Churchill or de Gaulle or Ronald Reagan, far away from you, at a distance, giving powerful rhetorical performances. But you are not like that person, like he's at a distance, almost like a godlike character. You have different views on him, but kind of far away. Charm is built on proximity, on the imagination that the politician could be your next door neighbor. He's a little awkward, he tells too many stories, whatever. You may find him annoying or her, but you could have a beer with her. That's a different kind of understanding of personal magnetism. And I think we still have some traditional forms of charisma, this kind of distance, like godlike version. But we also very strongly have the next door neighbor. Really think about the current election, all those videos of cooking or really visiting people or just hanging out together, discussing, which taco you like and so on. That there's pretty little about whether you would be a good president of the United States or vice president, right? Or, there is a reason why your next door neighbor is not running for president. Most of the cases, it requires different skills. A lot of being a president is about boring meetings, about delegating tasks, about diffusing tension and so on. Yet we want presidents and vice presidents to be like our next door neighbors. And that's what I call charm, this kind of proximity-based personal magnetism.
And do you think then, so we've talked about, I actually like vibes machines. I want to bring that back.
I like that. I was just thinking we should write it.
To what extent are technological changes in how we perceive politicians or public figures more broadly? And this is for you, but John, feel free to also answer this when at some point. To what extent is technology a factor in the transformation of, let's say, a charisma-based to charm-based account of parasocial relationships?
So I'm a university professor. I always teach 18-year-olds, and I love teaching them and learn a lot from them. So I have classes in which there are students with one and only news source is TikTok. Always ask them at the first class, what is your news source? What are you reading? And that's an important fact of political life, at least in the United States. So what does that mean? I mean, short video format is a different form of perception, and we have to reckon with that. Is it only a social media triggered phenomenon? That I don't think. I think it's more complicated than that. I generally don't believe in this kind of media defines everything kind of understanding. But there is a difference if you consider, as I said, just the sheer availability of visuals of professional politicians and their everyday lives. That's a different kind of understanding of politics. But again, not every politician uses it. I have a chapter in my book about Angela Merkel, who, Chancellor of Germany for 16 years, 80% approval rating, never showed her stepkids. You don't see her family. It's not her way of, you see Angela Merkel in the same jacket, color is changing, that's all. That's the difference. But she will not she will not appear as your next door neighbor.
How much is technology determining these changes? Well, again, I think it's a mixture of, again, from quasi Marxist point of view, like the social relations change with the change in technology. A lot of people say, when there was a whole debate about Trump being fascist, for example, a lot of people said, well, it's not mass politics like it was in the 20th century. But you have to think, well, the technology of political practice has changed an enormous amount. Like, you had to organize vast numbers of people to put on the kinds of spectacles, that fascist movements required, and that, they were also borrowing from the social organizations of the war and the factory. We have, wars and industry and the way we produce mass spectacles and movies and so on, or take a lot less labor, like the labor is embodied in machines. And yeah, the vistas that it gives us are more personal because we want to see people's homes and intimate environments less than, perhaps people who are, giving a talk to thousands of people. I do think, though, there may be some kind of nostalgia for stuff like that. And there's definitely people who still go out to political rallies and want to experience that kind of thing, or transcend the experience. It's not, these things are kind of existing in concert with each other. They're still, I think, what Julia might call the classical idea of charisma is existing with this idea of charm. But for sure, people's expectations of the performance of authenticity is changing a lot. Also, like, I don't know, America has always had a democratic and populist tradition where politicians that can seem folksy and relatable have an advantage. I mean, FDR was extraordinarily aristocratic and charismatic in this old sense, but he made a lot of effort to do things like go to a baseball game, be seen eating hot dogs. Like, there was an understanding that a democratic politician had to be democratic, but there was less of the type of aristocratic class bearing that FDR had, cigarette holder, martini, this would today would be absurd. And I mean, it may work, I don't know. But that sort of like understanding that there is a ruling class that's much different from us, I think is not something people like. Yeah.
So I do want to ask you both this next question, which is sort of more narrowly about religion and more broadly about leading. So in terms of sort of Weber's own writing on charisma, there is a strong component that there is something that charisma is indeed sort of classically, for some definition classically, was understood as a kind of supernatural gift, the sort of ability to do magic or in some way manipulate people's, whether it's their emotions or indeed reality itself. And there's a long-standing kind of magical tradition of that. Giordano Bruno's The Renaissance Magician is like all of his magic is about that. But more broadly, given that we are in an era that is in 2024 in the United States often referred to as a time of a crisis of meaning, or a time of spiritual fragmentation. We have sort of record numbers in the United States of the religiously unaffiliated. To what extent do vibes, or let's say emotive enchantment-based political conceptions become more popular? Certainly, and you know this, but as you find in classical writings about fascism, Mussolini's sort of fascist manifestos most prominently a very explicit sense that what fascism is or should be in part a replacement for, in that case, the Catholic Church, but religion more broadly. Yeah. How much does our contemporary American relationship to religion or its absence define the emotive nature of politics here? And then feel free to answer as well about more globally as well.
Oh, I think so the part of the right that I focus on is kind of the more there's a lot of talk about evangelicals in American politics for good reason. It's a huge, important constituency, highly influential. The part of the right that I'm focused on is more secular, and I think that the appeal of the secular right is underrated, and I think a lot of the movements in Europe, especially, are more secular. Do I feel, in some senses, that some of what they're looking for in politics is a substitute for religion? Yeah, in some cases, for sure. I think people are looking perhaps not for the idea. I think, what is religious life in practice? It's a communal experience. I mean, there might be an individual who's granted some power or authority through religious tradition or through being charismatically touched, but usually, it's an experience of community. And I don't think you can really say that that's not something people try to get out of politics, in the sense that, Trump is a nationalist politician, and he provides a view of a national community that's in threat or declining, that people have the nostalgia for. Is that nostalgia imaginary and notional and not really the way things are? Sure. But yeah, I think that one part of religion, religious experience, is essentially communal. I mean, there's mystics and so on and so forth, but I don't think that that's what sociologists are that interested in, or political historians are that interested in. So yeah, I think that there is, and then you have to take seriously that there are thousands, perhaps millions of people in the country that seem to think that one of the candidates in our election is divinely elected in some way. I mean, how seriously they'll take that in a few months, I don't know, but that is something that's said and apparently acted on. So yeah, I think that there is and conspiracy theories have obviously a kind of religious tone, and they're kind of negative religiosity in a way, but there is some kind of agency that's behind things, and some kind of organizing principles. Usually there's a story about providence and rescue and deliverance, Messiah from that. So yeah, those structures are all floating around, but I think it's true that they go beyond what you might think of as the religious right. And I don't think that that's fair. I mean, my particular focus is the right. But I'm not trying to ghettoize them and say, well, those are the people who are trying to get religious kicks out of politics. That happened. I mean, there's a lot of interesting things that are said about, progressive movements looking a lot like evangelical reform movements in the 19th century. And they're like, oh, they're still kind of doing temperance, and so I think it's all over politics. But my particular interest is the right, so that's what I can speak of.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I agree with that. I mean, I'm a social scientist, and in social science, there's a strong understanding that we live in a disenchanted society. It's fragmented society. It's less religion, less connection, less community, and so on. And I am always severely passionately disagree with this. And one way of describing what I'm doing in my work is always going against this. I think partly why we are doing this as social scientists, because we love definitions, and we love numbers and pinning down things and putting straitjacket definitions on them and then control them. Control them, it's fine. But you can't control it, right? Like the most exciting things in life, like love, love, charm for that matter, magic. These are things that are very difficult to define, very difficult to measure. Right? So we hate them as social scientists. We avoid them. Don't bring them anywhere near me, right? This is the approach. But again, the problem is that it still exists. And Tara's work is crucial in this area. By the way, we discuss our books here, but her book is like, if you wanted to understand magic in contemporary societies, read her. Right? And so I think it's crucial. Just think about people sleeping in front of the Apple store to get the latest iPhone. Like, there is nothing rational. But, there is a little tweak that may be different in the next edition. No, it's the totemic object you have to have. You just have to possess it. And there are so many examples of this in contemporary life in which we are not rational, we are deeply religious. It may not mean going to church on Sunday or going to the synagogue on Saturday or Friday evening, but it is deeply spiritual. And it's also there in, for instance, the parties you described, in which people, out of their minds, excited and so on. They don't follow a particular God, but they are in this mood of religion. And And I think that's crucial to social life. And if we have the courage and the bravery to deal with that, we will understand societies better.
Yeah, I think like, I mean, Weber obviously thought we lived in a rationalizing and disenchanting society, but famously, sorry, Marx said we it's actually quite the opposite. I say under conditions of commodity production, it's a mystified society. We have a kind of theological, he says it's a, you know, a theological relation to commodities, which Julia just mentioned. And you know, we live in a society where there's an enormous amount of production exchange going on, and it's kind of like this magical thing that happens. We treat it like magic in our social practice. If you looked at what was actually happening, there's actually, you know, extremely complicated relations of production and exchange going on. But you know, things just kind of appear to us magically. There's all this stuff. So yeah, I think that actually, especially with the acceleration of technology, it sort of re-enchants or creates another dimension of irrationality or apparent rationality to our experience of the life world. It's not just, oh, we don't really believe in anything anymore. We actually do, but you know, perhaps it's not religion, it's more objects. I don't know. Yeah.
I'm curious on another sort of avenue for vibes as well, so to speak. I mean, I think that something that you've both brought up in your work today is, let's say, the capitalist enchantment story, which is to say certain ways that desire is manipulated, especially in democracy, where a person's desire for a candidate can manifest into a vote, and that desire can be manipulated.
Yeah.
But another sort of element I'm curious about, both in the United States and actually as part of a global story, is the roles of vibes and nationalism. Something that really strikes me, I'm also a sort of 19th centuryist at heart, and what fascinates me most about so much of 19th century nationalism is kind of, in Europe specifically, is the kind of randomness of these national myths. I'm Italian. We're not really I mean, we are a country, but we're not. Italy is as invented a country as you can get, and yet somehow that sort of part of inventing a country is the creation of affective national myths. And as you mentioned at the very beginning of this conversation, John, like some of these myths are strong enough that you get people like Lord Byron going to, you know, die fighting, die sick while trying to fight for Greek independence.
Right.
And so I'm curious, sort of, is nationalism, particularly the kind of post-19th century understanding of the nation, itself something that demands a certain kind of politics of vibes or a relationship to both the emotive and the enchanted?
It's all about imagination. It's about an imagined past and community. It is, yeah, there's no, not to say it's not real, but it plays some of the history of the story. I mean, they're obviously shaped by national movements and intellectuals, but yeah, it plays on the imagination. And I think that that's a huge factor. I mean, all of my writing tries to deal with what the imagination is a political factor, and how that plays on people and how their conceptions of the world are being either, you know, fed or manipulated. So yeah, I mean, there's no escaping it. And apparently, you know, nationalism is one thing that really does not seem to go away. It is a recurrent and extreme organizing principle of politics that we can see unfolding before our eyes is quite strong.
Yeah, I mean, imagine communities, Benedict Anderson, and this whole theory. And I think it's really relevant. I often think of it very much, you know, personally as well, because I was 10 years old when Hungary went through a political change from a communist system to a democratic one. The grown-ups called it democratic transition. And how it's, you know, how was it? I mean, one of the things that I very much remember is going to the history class, and there were no history books. Previous books were thrown out. Nobody has written the new ones. So the history teacher went out to smoke a cigarette. And he said, like, what's the history? I have no idea. You know, and it was an unpredictable environment in many ways. And I remembers it. It had a lot of enchantment. And it made it very clear to me that these are invented narratives. So those history books had to be written. And I also remember capitalism coming into Hungary and the enchantment of it, you know, that for me, Marxism was the state ideology we learned in school. You know, for it was like the exact opposite. And then suddenly you have exerts coming and giving the first Ganz concert in Budapest. It's like, what is this? Is so exciting. Or standing in front of, I mean, people stood for 3 hours in front of the first McDonald's to eat a burger. Or my dad in full Disney suit from the National Library, where he was the vice director, who stood there 3 hours to get the first burger. And I remember just like thinking, this is, you know, I have arrived, basically, was my thinking, like, this is a whole new, different way of life. And but all this to say that, yes, I mean, these narratives define us and they are constructed and invented and very often also weaponized for the worst causes, including fascism.
So I have one question left for both of you, or one question for both of you to answer, and that is about to what extent is there a kind of conscious backlash against the idea of rationality, which is not to say are people irrational or more rational than now than they once were, but that are there kind of more, whether we're talking about institutional mistrust, the kind of either from the left or from the right, the quote unquote anti-science right, again, take that framing with a grain of salt, but also from the left, a particular, let's say, what is often framed as a sort of distrust of Enlightenment reason, or a sense that Enlightenment modes of knowing are insufficient. Do we live in an era that is more open to or conscious about its distrust of the possibility of rational truth that is knowable and shareable, or not?
Do you have a view on this?
Yes, but I'm the moderator now. Which is to say, I'm curious what you think, and I do have a view that will share, but I want to hear what you guys think first.
I don't know that there is an existing critique of rationality that's broadly shared, I think, among people, because that would already be some kind of rational process in itself. I think that there is conditions which make the forming of rationality, of broadly shared notions of rationality, difficult. I think that I mean, it's extremely, and you saw this unfold during the pandemic, where, you know, putatively you think, well, there are certain objective things going on here. This is something that we can examine scientifically, and there's studies, and then there's going to be an appropriate response. Maybe we get it wrong, maybe we get it right, but there's evidence and there's a scientific process, and then the actual response to it is much more freighted with politics and emotion and different agendas or experiences than you would think. And then it's a little shocking to say, well, there's evidence here, and we can weigh this, and but some people say absolutely not, or sometimes science itself, the image of science itself becomes its own irrationality, where people say that this is the scientific truth, and that becomes its own kind of dogma, which is not how science is meant to be practiced. I don't know. I'm tend to fall into, but I'm also suspicious of declinist narratives where there's something particularly wrong. I don't think reason as an idea has done that well. I mean, I don't think. I mean, if you look at the 20th century, most horrible century ever, right? Horrible wars, genocides. You could say national communities had a stronger sense of public reason because of mass media and less public distrust in certain examples, at least in the second half of the century. But what did that deliver? So I'm hesitant to say what's changed, what's the same. I think people, I'm not a total relativist. I think that, but there are different conceptions of what's rational. And when you take politics seriously and you take social life seriously, not only reason giving and taking are going to be what you need to focus on. There are other considerations. And if you're a serious thinker about those things, you have to learn their languages. And I think that's what we both do in our work, and I think you as well. And try to give it a rational structure that people can understand. That's not always possible. It's a process of interpretation and elucidation, but there is an always retreating irrationality that, and I don't believe that, there's final system by which we can understand everything, and there's one science of society, or one, if there was one, it would be Marxism. But but yeah, I think that's basically my answer to the question. Is they're what we call rational or irrational vary in different contexts. There will always be things that are not entirely able to be comprehended with the tools of the quantitative sciences, and qualitative assessments will be necessary to be able to understand the world.
This complexity and nuance is why I really liked your book.
Oh, thank you.
Because I think it would be easy to give like a knee-jerk, quick reaction to a question like this one, but it is more complicated, right? So I struggle with this a lot because on the one hand, my work always argues, magic is important, enchantment is important. I love seduction. I find it really hypocritical that people say, oh, we don't want seduction. Everybody wants to be seduced some way or another. I think we should just admit that. But on the other hand, I do think that there are things called facts, right? Like I'm not ready to say that was Kennedy. Is Kennedy alive? No, he's not. Like, so, I mean, that there must be some kind of.
My next book.
Oh,
I'm kidding. Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So I think that there need to be these kind of basic agreed upon facts at the same time. But how do we establish them, and through what negotiations? Those are the complicated moments, right?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It's very difficult. I mean, and people will perceive that as some people will perceive that as authoritarian, because it is, and by virtue of the word, it is an authority. Some things happen through authority. I mean, like, I trust that someone, I mean, not to the degree I think that is in itself irrational, but to a certain degree, I trust that someone knows their business and speaks from a level of authority. That's not irrational. They have a justified authority. And I think it's been adequately proven that there's some reason why they speak authoritatively about the subject. But yeah, certain people will always, in a democracy where everybody's voice and opinion is given equal weight, in theory, some people will perceive people who speak authoritatively as some kind of imposition. They have a right not to listen to it to a certain extent, but then you see the bigger effects of it in something like, say, where there's public health involved, and you say, well, you really can't, or even regimes of like insurance, it's like, well, you can't not have car insurance. You can't, or when they try to do individual mandate, like, it's irrational for all of us to follow a single set of rules. But yeah, I don't have the answer of when. I think living in a democracy is a constant process of revision of those structures of authority that happens in public, and that's good. But sometimes, obviously, that discussion doesn't happen at the level of granularity and nuance and complexity that like a scientific discussion needs to happen. But I'm uncomfortable as a Democrat at heart with the tendency of some liberal intellectuals to say democratic deliberation is intrinsically stupid and leave it all up to experts. Because we've seen, and I think your book makes a perfect example of this, is that a lot of experts, and Alistair McIntyre talked about this a long time ago, is that bureaucratic expertise in itself is a performance. it's a matter of appearing authoritative rather than necessarily having the knowledge. It's a certain affect, you know, and we, especially liberals, relate to that in a way that's almost religious or charismatic or perhaps closer to charm. Like, you know, certain public figures, bureaucrats, I'm not going to name any names, have for certain constituencies almost religious significance. You're like, well, that's the guy who really knows what he's talking about. And yeah, their authority is earned to a certain extent, but you know, it is not inappropriate in a democracy to be skeptical of them or to criticize them. But it's a very difficult, yeah, I think it's kind of a mess. It's always going to be kind of a mess. It's a big mess now. I don't know how to fix it, if that's what you're asking me. Yeah.
It's also like it's really the question of expertise and bureaucracy on the one hand, you know, medical expertise, for instance, we all turn to that, right? We need that. But at the same time, I often think that where I thought the most about this question is if you visit the Wannsee conference house where the final solution was in many ways decided, it's one of the most gorgeous places you can imagine in the world at Lake Wannsee. It's stunningly beautiful villa. You have experts, you know, bureaucrats there with the power of expertise. And what are they doing? They are designing a genocide. And then you can read through the documents there of how they planned down to the tiniest details. And that's what they did in that stunning environment. And so, I mean, it's just thinking of that shows you that all the magic and enchantment is there. But if you have an absolute belief in bureaucratic rationality, you also have that.
Yeah, I think one definition of fascism is a combination of that enchantment, I believe, simultaneously in bureaucratic rationality plus enchantment or some kind of magical charismatic thing. It's a good thing, but those things still coexist in our world. Yeah.
So I do want to, I think I'm wrapping it up here. But I do, I guess, insofar as I promised to weigh in on this to Julia, I guess a curiosity that I have when I kind of want to leave this with is to me, the question of rationality is also the question, is a question about both metaphysical realism and kind of epistemology at the same time, which is to say, is there some kind of absolute truth, whether or not we can know it, is sort of question one, and you could even perhaps subdivide it into, you know, qualitative versus quantitative truths, or, you know, okay, we can sort of know that 2 and 2 is 4, but we're never going to know the nature of the good. And then the sort of second question, can we ever know this, not just because is it knowable, but is there something about human nature and human political relationships that make the pursuit of knowledge always so much about individual power that we kind of can't trust anybody's answer who claims to be looking for solution. And I do think that these two questions do go hand in hand to the extent that I think we are in an era that both distrusts the possibility of absolute truth and also distrusts and certainly anyone claiming to be able to get close to it. And I think perhaps one might say for good reasons in some cases. I think that there are there's a lot of reason for public mistrust, and yet but I think I am not settled in my own mind whether it is a sort of metaphysical question first that has ramifications for how we see one another, or it's a political question first that kind of leads us towards a distrust of truth because we don't trust people. That I'm not sure about. But then I think I'm going to call it. Thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Sorry for the delay, guys. And also, is there any chance that maybe 2 people can come to the front? Just because if we have new people coming late, they will want to sit down in the back, and everybody's sitting in the back with some volunteers.
Comfortable. I was just going because that was when Tara was getting.
Is this somebody's?
I think that's the.
Oh,
Like,
well then I'm sorry for disrupting
No,
the work someone did to carefully place that.
So with an honor to finally be on a panel with you.
Yeah, it's great.
It's wonderful to be here with Musa al-Gharbi and Barry Kaufman. My name is Skye Cleary. But first of all, Musa is the
Was blinded.
Musa is the Paul F. Lazarsfeld Fellow in Sociology at Columbia University, and his work explores social phenomena, including race inequality, social movements, extremism, policing, national security, and more. And his new book, We Have Never Been Woke, Social Justice, Discourse, Inequality, and the Rise of a New Elite, comes out on Tuesday. So congratulations. And Barry Kaufman is a professor of psychology at Columbia University as well. And he is the director of the Center for Human Potential. And he is among the top 1% of the most cited scientists in the world for his research on creativity and intelligence. And he hosts the Psychology podcast, of which I have been honored to be a guest of. And he's the author most recently of Transcend, A New Science of Self-Actualization, which is fabulous. I've read it. And his next book, due out next year, is on victim mentality. So I hope we'll hear more about those books during the next 40 minutes or so. So the topic of this panel is educators and the changing role of academia as a counterbalance, check, or training ground for the powerful. Now, this seems pretty timely to me, given the recent turmoil on university campuses, with pro-Palestinian protests, especially which started up at Columbia. But student activism isn't new, of course. Apparently, there are student protests dating back to the 13th century. And it's also unclear as to what extent the link between academia and political change and social change. So that link, there does seem to be a link. So far in the recent protests, it's maybe, I don't know, too early to tell what the impact of those are going to be. But think about, for example, the protests against the Vietnam War. So that did lead to a lot of change. Columbia changed their policies on allowing military recruitment on campus and stopped doing classified military research, and those protests seem to contribute to the downfall of the Nixon administration, perhaps. So there is a strong link between student activism and what goes on campus and political change. And big shifts in society. And as Anna mentioned, my background is 20th century French shenanigans. I love that word, which is a really good description. And so I focus a lot on Simone de Beauvoir and Jean-Paul Sartre, French intellectuals who grappled a lot with their role and responsibility to participate in or to give opinions about political situations. And they weren't really political until World War II. And then it was hard for them not to be political. And they realized they had to use their intelligence and their stature in order to actually make the world a better place and try and fight against fascism. So today we're going to talk about the link between academia and power. But first of all, I want to go back to the topic of this session and think a little bit about, or ask you both about, to what extent is academia a training ground for the powerful? I'm thinking up at Columbia, we have people like Obama, FDR, Warren Buffett, Timothy Chalamet, and the Clintons went to Yale, and plenty of people came out of, powerful people came out of Harvard. But to what extent do you think universities are training ground for powerful and elite in a society? Can we go first to you, Musa?
Sure. Yeah, so Ivy League schools, especially these kinds of elite schools that the people you just mentioned, they've always been, that's been consistently their role in society, is to help identify people who belong amongst the elite and credential them such that they can walk around saying, I'm a person you should listen to. So for instance, before I was at Columbia University, I would pitch articles to the New York Times and the Washington Post, and I wouldn't even get a no. I was below a rejection. When I went to Columbia, I had the editors of the New York Times and the Washington Post email me out of the cold, hey, would you like to write something about love? And it wasn't because I became such a much better writer in the time it took to move from Sierra Vista, Arizona to the Upper West Side of Manhattan. It's purely institutional effects and network effects and things like this. And that's not unusual. One of the things that's critical, though, I think a lot of this focus, a lot of the conversation about schools and power, in a sense, even over focuses on elite schools. In general, I think increasingly college degrees, in a broader sense, almost regardless of where they're from, help sort people into the kind of people who are going to have good middle class to upper middle class lives, or the kind of people who are worth listening to or taken seriously. There's a great article by Bertram Cooper about George Floyd. And he basically argues if George Floyd was still alive, if he hadn't been killed, no one, there are all these articles in the New York Times and the Washington Post and documentaries on HBO and other things. If George Floyd were alive, none of these people would have cared about him, wanted to hear about him. He wouldn't have, if he wanted to write for the New York Times or the Washington Post, he would have never been able to because he doesn't have a college degree. And so there's kind of perverse reality where it's only after he was the victim of state violence that his life suddenly has value and meaning. For a lot of people who are not tied to educational institutions, they find themselves in the position that George Floyd was in. No one really cares what they think. They don't really have access to. And in fact, they don't even have access in many cases to stable middle class lives, let alone anything beyond that. I'll stop there first.
Yeah, Scott, you've had a lot of experience or research in flourishing and human potential. We'd love to hear your perspective on this.
Yeah, first of all, congrats on the Washington Examiner positive review.
Oh, yes, thank you.
I'm behind a paywall, so I can't read it, but I know it's positive. You said so. And I will also genuinely love to hear more of the main thesis of your new book as well. My thoughts about this are kind of all over the place because I'm such a, I can see every side, and that's part of my downfall as well as my upside, perhaps, is I can see every perspective. It's interesting because I am very concerned about the increasing rising distrust of experts that we're seeing amongst the powerful. I don't think anyone can deny that Joe Rogan's powerful, that's power, right? Donald Trump is pretty powerful. Is he out there being like, oh, I'm from Harvard,
What? No, he does though. He brags about his business degree from Wharton, how smart he is and his IQ.
But does his audience care about that? I don't think that's his selling point at his rallies. But he's smart though. In some sort of sense, he's extraordinarily a genius in terms of he knows who to target when, right? First of all, I just want to say I am very concerned about this increasing distrust of scientists, distrust of, because I don't want to be out of a job. I'm top 1% scientist. I don't want to be, viewed as, irrelevant in the age of the powerful. You can say whatever you want on whatever podcast you want to just go off about, and I see all these kinds. I listen to these podcasts. I listen very carefully, and I'm like, holy cow! People just believe whatever. If you have a charismatic, this relates a lot to that panel we just had before, because I study narcissism. I study the dark triad traits, which are narcissism, psychopathy, and Machiavellianism. And then I also created the opposite, the white triad, which is, let's see, I can't remember what the three are. Faith in humanity, believing in general faith in humanity, Kantianism, which is a really nerdy opposite of Machiavellianism, if anyone gets it, categorical imperative number one. And the third thing is humanism, believing in the dignity and worth of each individual. So from my lens as a personality psychologist studying the dark triad, I think the dark triad is agnostic to political party. So I sit back here not from a political lens, but from everywhere I look, I see narcissists. That's my lens. Everywhere I look, I see a victim mindset. On the left, the right, the center, up, down, diagonal. You know, I can't look anywhere these days and see someone who doesn't have a victim mindset. So that's just the lens I bring. Yeah. Can't wait for this discussion.
Yeah, so just to take that a little bit further, and back to the topic, which is to what extent is academia a counterbalance or check to power structures? I mean, it sounds like you're doing work in terms of checking those power structures and you're both doing that by sort of criticizing those in power and what's going on. So, I mean, I'm just wondering about, do you see yourselves as unique in that perspective, or to what to what extent should academics be more like you and be politically engaged?
Well, it's funny. So for my book is very critical of a lot of institutions and the ways that knowledge economy professionals kind of leverage social justice discourse to kind of justify their power grabs and their status bids and things like this. But I wouldn't actually describe the project of the book as like it has political implications or something, but I didn't write the book because I was trying to score points for this faction or take down that faction. I was just trying to kind of tell the truth. And in fact, say truths that other people maybe don't feel comfortable saying or would avoid saying. I think when people read the book, they will learn new things that they didn't know before. They will be like, oh, wow, that's perfect. But like, but I think like a lot of what they'll do actually, like my hope is that as people read the book, what they'll do is they'll see like society around, like they'll readily recognize. I won't be telling them things they don't know. I'll be showing them, helping them see things that they already do see. I'll be giving them a language to talk about that in a way that they didn't have before. And so my goal is to is not necessarily some kind of political goal in that sense. That said, I used to avoid political stuff in general. Like I used to think politics was dumb. It was people getting distracted by the little things. I was focused on the structure and meaning of reality and the meaning of life and things like that. And then I had a twin brother and he was killed in Afghanistan. And in the aftermath of that, I realized that politics was kind of more important than I thought and was important in different ways than I thought. And so I shifted my focus from these kinds of questions about metaphysics and things like this to kind of focusing on national and security and foreign policy questions, like applied social epistemology is so like what do we know in virtue of what, with the goal of like helping other families avoid the kind of tragedy that my own family was working through. So there's a sense in which that's political, right? But it's not political in the sense of like rah Joe Biden, boo boo orange man. It's like it's kind of and so I try to avoid that. And in fact, I think that kind of rots the brain. So I have a lot of work, a lot of scholarly papers and other papers that, and other kind of public-facing writing about how when scholars really lean too heavily into activism or into kind of give into this kind of political, ideological, cultural stuff, it really, really, really messes up their work a lot. Setting aside the questions about public trust and all of that, it just makes their work crappy. And so I try not to do that myself.
You're really good at confusing me on your position on anything. Does anyone know his actual position? So I've been researching you to prepare for this, and I can't tell in anything I read of yours like what does he believe in anything. And it's on the one hand that's great. I mean that's actually a major compliment in a culture where, like, for instance, you go to these like Paradox Academy conferences, or like I just recently went to this one that was like huge stages and it was elaborate, and everyone was like sussing you out to be like, are you anti-woke or woke? Yeah. It's like you had to like on entrance, you had to state whether you're, and I genuinely can't tell if you're woke or anti-woke, and that's your point, right? Because that's well played, sir. well played. I can't tell where you are on this. I'm like, like at least give the woke a little shit, or give the right a little shit, give someone some shit. You don't give anyone any shit. But I don't know what my point is beyond that, which is just you're a fascinating, real unique in the space, and it is to your testament that you said you care about the truth, and I don't really think that's prominent, in this cultural war, is an interest in the truth for sure. Touched on activism, and I'm really glad you did kind of give activists a little shit there subtly at the end there, and I really like that because I write I'm working this new book coming out next year, which is going to be definitely controversial, and I have a section on narcissistic activists and why they're a real big problem in our society right now, and trying to distinguish that from non-ego based activism that is productive, that moves forward society. We need to do a much better job differentiating between these two types, because you're seeing a lot of people now who have dark triad traits, co-opting and exploiting college students with really good intentions, who have big hearts, and they're exploiting them for their own dark triad agenda. And I see it so clearly, and I think we need to call that out. Whilst at the same, listen to me, I just became British. Whilst at the same time acknowledging all the caveats and all the things Skye was saying about the major benefits, there's no way I would compare the Vietnam War protests to what we're seeing right now in Colombia. I wouldn't. I just got an email on the way here saying, "Dear Colombia community, prepare for violence in the next 3 days." That's not, that's not peace, love, and, end the Vietnam War. That's something else. So, say all that. We should be wary of that.
So Scott, are you anti-woke? Is that what I'm hearing?
Oh, no. Again, I want to be like this cat, where you can't really tell, but I am definitely anti-dark triad traits, and I'm not afraid to call them out on the left. That's what I am.
And one of the things I'm thinking about as we're talking about political activism as educators is, we're told in the classroom where we're not allowed to share political views specifically, although we can talk about politics in a general sense. But then, during the recent protests, we've seen academics be involved in activism, and so which raises the question: okay, so even if you're not sharing political opinions in the classroom, to what extent do you think we should be allowed to be political outside the classroom, whether it's on campus in protest, or even I heard someone, a tenured professor, I think you mentioned a tenured professor recently got fired for sharing an Instagram post that was
pro-Palestine beliefs, yeah.
Yeah, so where do you think we should be drawing the line on being able to participate in shaping the world as academics, and where do we need to check ourselves?
So Max Weber, so I'll do like Tara and Julie, I'll drop in the obligatory Weber reference. So Weber famously argued that it's really an abuse of power and an abuse of trust for people in acting in their capacity as professors or things like that to try to foist their political views on other people. But that said, he also emphasized in the vocation lectures and beyond that in addition to being professors aren't all that you are. If you're a professor, you're also a citizen in a democracy, and you have duties and obligations and responsibilities and interests and motives. Like, you're a full, complete human being, just like everyone who's not a professor. And so, in that sense, Weber thought that as citizens, you have the same kinds of obligations that other citizens have to take part in the life of your community and to try to shape public events in the ways that you think are moral and things like this. So I think it's a question of kind of how you carry out that kind of work. That said, well, actually, I'll pause there. I'll let Scott, and then
I'm still formulating my thoughts on this particular question.
I
I want to hear more about the main thesis of your new book.
Yeah, why don't you tell us about that?
Like, what's the main thesis of it?
Yeah, so what the book wants to explore is basically starting in the period between World War I and World War II, accelerating after the 1970s, there were these shifts to the global economy that favored the knowledge in favor of the knowledge economy. So people who work in media, tech, finance, things like this, people who do not provide physical goods and services to people. And one of the things that's interesting is that people who work in these professions, a lot of these professions have defined themselves from the beginning in terms of social justice. So journalists are supposed to speak truth to power and be a voice for the voiceless. Academics are supposed to follow the truth wherever it leads without regards to political or financial interests, and so on and so forth. And when you look at people who work in these professions today, we're the Americans who are most likely to self-identify as environmentalists or anti-racists or feminists or allies to LGBTQ people, or even as LGBTQ. And so what you might expect is that as people like us have more power and influence over society, that you'd see inequality shrinking, and you'd see a lot of longstanding social problems be getting fixed, and you'd see increasing trust in institutions because of all the great work that we're doing for everyone. Instead, over the last 50 years, you've seen the opposite: growing inequality, growing affective polarization, growing mistrust in institution, increasing institutional dysfunction. And so the big puzzle that the book is trying to ask is basically, well, what's going on there? And
Did you figure it out?
yeah. And so the
Go on.
And so the kind of nutshell version of the answer is that it's absolutely the case that a lot of people who work in these professions are committed to social justice. Like we actually believe the thing. It's not that we're cynical and insincere or anything like that. We have these sincere commitments, but they're not the only sincere commitments we have. We also really want to be elites, which is to say we think that we deserve a higher standard of living than other people. We want people to defer to us. When we think people should take our opinion more seriously than the person checking us out at Stop and Shop. We want our kids to have the same position as us, or even better, kind of reproduce or enhance their own our own social position in their lives. And these two drives are at fundamental tension with each other, right? You can't really be an egalitarian social climate. And this kind of tension has defined the symbolic professions for the last century, and continues to define them today. And it, when these two drives come into conflict, it's typically the desire to be an elite that ends up winning out and ends up transforming our pursuit of social justice towards these kinds of symbolic things that don't require us to change or sacrifice anything meaningful about our lives. So how can we achieve these goals by symbolic acts, or by taking things from other people, ideally, if we could. And so a few things that the book briefly points out is, if you look at knowledge economies professionals and our narratives about who's to blame, why are things wrong, we have two basic answers. One is those damn Republicans, especially those MAGA people, and the other one is the millionaires and the billionaires and the multinational corporations. The problem with both of those narratives, one of them, if you hovered up all of the kind of MAGA people, if aliens just came down to Earth and phew, they're all gone, a lot of the problems that we're concerned about would persist unchanged, because they're actually worse. And a lot of the institutions that we're a part of are far more parochial than most other jobs in America, the communities that we're a part of. Here in New York City, in the New York State, in fact, 1 out of every 12 residents of New York State is a millionaire. We also have some of the highest poverty rates in the country. We have some of the highest racial segregation in the country, the most segregated school system in the country, and so on. And we can't blame Republicans for that. Democrats control this area with one-party rule, basically. The primary election is the election for New York, City. And the same is true with the millionaires and the billionaires and the multinational corporations. If you want to understand how anything that they do, how they do it, it's us that make it happen. And so these kinds of narratives and our approaches to social justice are just really not effective at accomplishing the goals that we do have. We do hold these beliefs, but we also really want to be elites.
I completely agree. What do you think is a better route to accomplishing social justice goals?
Yeah, so I don't really do that in the book. In the book, most books, there's like 7 chapters describing a problem, and then the conclusion is like, here's my 12 steps to like completely fix the world. And that chapter is always really unsatisfying. And so rather than doing that, I decided to leave the readers in a kind of willful state of discomfort. And I gave a willfully dissatisfying conclusion. And part of my hope is that rather than me trying to provide set of easy answers I want to start a conversation about. I do think that question is important. It's the most important question. But I don't want to be the spiritual, I don't want to be the next Ta-Nehisi Coates providing spiritual advice for the, sorry. Well, Ta-Nehisi Coates doesn't want to be Ta-Nehisi Coates in that respect, and he's actively torched.
I don't understand that reference, but you'll explain it to me later. Can I play devil's advocate?
Yeah.
I'm not saying this is my position, but I want to play devil's advocate. If Ben Shapiro was here, this is what he would ask you. No, but I am generally curious. Like, you're just still assuming the problem is like we needed better methods of social justice. What if the answer is we need to stop focusing so much on social justice and focus more on just justice? You know, and to not make it so much about identity.
Well, no, yeah. So I don't actually. I think one of the things I highlight in the book. Well, okay, there are two things I think that are important here. One is that there's a narrative about identitarian forms of social justice that make it seem like these identitarian approaches are somehow uniquely prone to elite capture. And if only we just focused on class-based stuff instead, well, then we wouldn't have this capture. But actually, history is replete with class-based social movements that were also captured by elites and became really authoritarian and oppressive and exploitative. And parochial, and so like the idea that if we just have the right conception of social justice, then we won't have elite capture. That's not the issue. The issue is the elite capture. It's finding a way to check the elites so we can't leverage these social justice narratives, whether they're identitarian focused or class focused or otherwise, in the pursuit of our own ends as easily. But yeah, but in the book, but I do think there are definitely some strong limitations to the extent that we can achieve a lot of the goals that we have for helping the poor, for helping those who are marginalized and disadvantaged in society and so on, by focusing narrowly on race, gender, sexuality, and things like that. I do think there are like significant limits to the ability, but on the other hand, and in fact, there's a great Vivek Chibber has a great book called The Class Matrix, which is about how like classical Marxist analysis assumed that the kind of class-based inequality was at the root of almost all other forms of repression and exploitation were kind of downstream from. So if you solve capitalism, racism goes away, sexism and misogyny go away, and all of this other stuff. If you just deal with this central form of oppression, then the rest of them are. I don't think that's true. I think we do have these fundamental drives to hate people who are different. Well, I'm at Columbia. Well, I'm not actually anymore. I'm at Stony Brook. But
alternative to having, we allowed to have,
I write for the New York Times. I mean, like, how can I? I am an elite.
Look, the only alternative to having a society where there's no elite is like socialism. Okay, and there are fans of that in this room, I know. So like, let's say the uphold oppressed rise up and they become elites, then would you be happy with that?
Well, again, I just said like history is full of these examples, and in fact, one of the big ways that a lot of the conversations about social justice go awry, especially the identitarian stuff, but not exclusively, is there's this assumption that if you just reverse all the signs, if you take the people who are oppressed and marginalized and you just let them be on the top for a while, then somehow they have this kind of, this kind of moral purity and this kind of insight into society as a result of being oppressed. But history is, in the United States and actually around the world, is just full of cases of formerly oppressed and subaltern populations who get power and prove themselves to be every bit as depraved as the people that they overthrew, as I highlighted a couple of years ago in this piece for the Chronicle, among others.
I'm glad you said that, by the way. Okay.
Yeah, and so yeah, the idea isn't like you just take the people who are the oppressed and let them be the oppressors for a while. Then obviously that's
We're on the same
not
page.
good.
We're on the same page.
Yeah.
But I don't know. There's just so many like assumptions that were raised that I just want to unpack in what you were saying. But thank you for clarifying a lot of it.
Scott, I'd love to go back to your devil's advocate suggestion is, do we need to focus on justice instead of social justice? I mean, is that your view?
Well, there's this whole debate on what should be the telos of, Jonathan Haidt loves that word, you know, he's like telos of universities. What should it be? And it should be truth, not social justice. Now, I actually think that there's room at the top for both focus on justice and truth. And I got in a debate with Jonathan about that. So my position is actually that I'm not so rigid about that, like, you know, because there are a lot of students who do go to college because they want to make the world a better place. They are into progressive activism. They're into, they're not going to be scientists, you know, and what are we saying? There's no place for those people? Like, what does that mean? You know, like, that sounds discriminatory. So I got into a debate with him about that. But then there is that nuance between justice and social justice. There's that nuance. And I recognize there's, that's like a landmine. You know, did you want me to step on that landmine? Homegirl.
Sure, it's up to now.
No, it's a landmine. Because I think that, you know, depending on your lens of, you know, everyone else has the power and you don't have the power, you know, and I'm friends with people who all hate each other, but they somehow like me, you know, so I get a chance to have text messages with like one guy I'm friends with, like, I'll just call out names, like Jason Stanley, you know, I'm like texting with, you know, nonstop, and he's like, oh, fuck those fascists, right? And then I'm like texting with, and I won't mention who else I'm texting with, who's the guy, he said, fuck that guy, and he's like, oh, fuck Jason Stanley, and he has all the power. But here, it's fascinating. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But here's the interesting thing, because I have this view into like these prominent people who are on both sides, and on this person's side, the problem with academia is that the fascists are ruining you know, the teaching of critical race theory. That's Jason's argument, and he's public about that. So I'm not like outing him, you know, like he wrote a book, you know, about this, you know, 2 books about this. The problem in his view is that the fascists are ruining academia. The downfall of academia was because of the fascists. But then you go to all these heterodox academy conferences, and they're like, the downfall of academia are these woke, annoying people, right? And so it's like, depending on the lens, you know, so I have not answered your question, but I really think we need to take a broader view of the situation that acknowledges that you can have multiple victims. It's almost like we're incapable of comprehending the state of affairs where there are multiple injustices on your side and another side. And I don't think we're going to make progress in our society till like all sides at least start to acknowledge their own contribution to the other side suffering.
So this point about critical race theory bans is actually a nice segue to this question about politics in universities. Because so one of the things that my book highlights is that it's typically the case that people who work in the knowledge professions are weird politically. Like, we have we have different beliefs than most other Americans. We think about politics in importantly different ways. We tend to be more dogmatic. We tend to be more ideological. We tend to be more ideologically extreme. We understand ourselves to be the opposite of that, as being kind of more rational and this other kind of stuff. But we're actually less likely to change our minds when confronted with facts that disagree, precisely because we have actually a lot more skill and knowledge to punch holes in things that we disagree with or justify just sticking to our guns anyway, and so on. But anyway, so we tend to be weird compared to most people. And as the book shows, there are these periods when knowledge economy professionals undergo these shifts, these kinds of rapid periods of normative change and discursive change. So we change how we think and talk about social justice really rapidly and really dramatically. And during those periods, the gaps between us and most other Americans grow a lot bigger. So they're always pretty big. They get bigger during these periods, like we saw after 2010, this is the most recent one. And not only do they get bigger, they also get more salient, because we go out of our way during these periods. We become much more militant, much more likely to confront and try to suppress and demonize people who disagree with us than normal. So other people care about this difference more than typical. And this creates a space for political entrepreneurs to basically campaign by bringing people like us under control, by bringing us to heel. The media has become a propaganda arm for the Democratic Party and Kamala Harris. The universities are just indoctrinating students instead of teaching them useful And so this kind of backlash that we're seeing now is actually a case of something. It usually follows each of these periods of awakening, as I show in my book. And not only so to the extent that we actually do become intolerant, censorious, and this kind of stuff during these periods more than usual, we actually give rise to this backlash. And more than that, we often give rise to these alternative infrastructures. So after the 1960s and 70s, for instance, there was this perception, academia is lost, you can't fix it. So what did they do? A lot of right-leaning people created political think tanks like Heritage and Cato as an alternative to academia. After the 1990s, there was a perception the media was lost. So what did they do? They created organizations like Fox News, which eat mainstream media's lunch all day, every day. They're the dominant and have been for some time. And in the most recent case, you see these efforts by people like Peter Thiel to take over Rumble, or Donald Trump to launch Truth Social, or Elon Musk to do this anti-woke takeover of Twitter. All of this kind of a thing is par for the course. And what's critical is that when we create the kind of market or an appetite for these alternative structures of knowledge production, it often is very devastating for us in the long term, both because, again, like in the case of Fox, sometimes they outperform the mainstream, but second, because these institutions have an existential stake. Like the way that they make money, the way that they get eyeballs, the way that they keep themselves in business is by sowing mistrust in mainstream institutions 24/7 and trying to differentiate themselves from us. So if you watch Fox all day, every day, it's the media is biased. They're not telling you the truth. They're not telling you the truth.
CNN doesn't do that.
Say that the media is biased and the mainstream media is not telling you the
Saying
truth.
that Fox News is biased.
Well, no, but this is my point is, so you end up with these kinds of institutional culture wars, these institutionalized culture wars. These kinds of awakenings usually devolve into culture wars and usually result in the creation of these alternative infrastructures that keep the culture wars going basically constantly. That's how they stay alive. That's how they stay in business. And so to the extent that we create a market for these kinds of political entrepreneurs by how we conduct ourselves during these periods of awakening, we basically are giving shovels to our own grave diggers to sprinkle some Marxian imagery in it.
So we've been talking a little bit about impact on students, and I'd like to dig into that. So these traditional institutions, the universities, I wonder, and with these other institutions popping up, competing institutions, but bringing it back to what we do. And Scott, this question is going to be for you, first of all.
Oh, okay.
Like, to what extent are universities doing a good job in nurturing students to become self-actualized and self-actualized leaders? And
the great question, Dan. Look, whenever I hear questions like, what are the universities doing? I mean, universities are comprised of professors, and there's huge variation in quality of professors. There are professors, at my institution that drive me mad, and I think should be free speech. They should stay there, but they still suck, and there are professors who are, really are wonderful. There are students, I'd say on the whole, the students are actually wonderful. I think there's kind of this perception, that if you turn on Fox News, there's this perception that students are running the campus. They're all just running around, they've got the professors in cages, or whatever. I am so I'm teaching a course in self-actualization this semester. And my dad came to visit Monday, and I was looking at my dad, he was looking at me, we're like, we are blown away impressed with these students. I had a seminar class, 21 students. They all couldn't be further different from each other in terms of religion, in terms of race, in terms of everything. And we discussed everything, like no, what's the expression? No holds barred? Is it holds barred? Okay. Whatever. But it's respectful and it can be done, and that's not my way of slipping out of it. But I think that when people ask about how are colleges doing, it's up to the professors, to take control of your classroom, On the first day of I teach the most popular course at Columbia called The Science of Living Well, and a 300-person lecture. On the first class, I say, leave your politics at the door. This class is not go to the political science or whatever department. This is about how to live your best life. And I think you just have to set the tone, and you can do that.
I think one of the things that I think people miss about students actually is like students are actually one of the most politically heterogeneous bodies on campus. So there's a lot more, students are a lot more politically and ideologically diverse than say professors are. And there's a lot more Republican students than there are Republican professors. And there's a lot more Republican, like conservative and stuff professors and administrators. Kind of the higher up you go, the kind of more ideologically pure the academy becomes. And so students have this rap for being kind of overwhelmingly left or something. They're actually a lot more heterogeneous than they appear to be. Part of the reason that they appear to be so left is because students are also, like professors, are very concerned about fitting in with their peers and trying to say things that are kind of high status and fashionable. So colleagues and I have a paper that we published recently in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences on censorship and self-censorship in science. And what we find is that most of the time when scientists are censored or self-censor, they're doing it to each other and themselves. They're not being censored by outside actors like Fox News or multinational corporations or the government or these kind of other bodies. They're censoring each other, often driven by pro-social concerns because they think other people will get led astray or because they're concerned about how the impacts of the researcher. And this dynamic that you see with professors actually isn't unique to professors. It's true of students as well. A lot of censorship and self-censorship is actually lateral. It's people trying to, stay in the good graces of their peers. They don't want to be the person who's hated. They want to still get dates and things like that. Yeah, so I think that they are a lot more, universities are actually a lot more heterogeneous spaces, especially students are much more heterogeneous than they're often perceived as being. Yeah. That said, I think one of the ways teachers go awry sometimes is I think universities, I think we focus on certain things much more than we should and on other things not enough. So for instance, I think we focus a lot on refining students' critical capacities. So what's wrong with things, taking things apart, deconstructing things. I think we don't really invest much in refining students' affirmative capacities. So what works, what's good about the thing that you're reading, what's the model that you should draw from here, what actually works about the prevailing order, why does it work, how does it work, what would you actually want to preserve instead of what would you want to change? And I think similarly, I think we're really focused on change because a lot of us, it's just kind of the culture of the academy and selection effects and all of this. Like I said, we are kind of weirdos compared to the rest of society. But I think we're really focused on questions about change and how to make change happen and why isn't change happening, when actually, and not a lot on questions about persistence. And actually, if you think about it, persistence is a bigger question. Like, change is inevitable. People are cycling in and out of institutions all the time. Technologies are constantly evolving. Resources are constantly changing hands. External actors are interfering in systems all the time. So how do you get order that persists over time, even as the people in them are cycling in and out all the time? Like, that's not just a thing that happens, it's an achievement. And I think like as analysts and scholars and stuff, we actually don't pay that much attention to social order because we're really focused on change. And I think we don't really focus on, again, our developing students' affirmative capacities because we're really focused on criticism and critical capacities and things like that. And so that's one way in which I think sometimes we kind of misserve our students, don't make them as complete as they could be in terms of their understanding.
So we need more social order on campus. I really do believe that is the case. Yeah. Got a weirdo on the wall. We're the adults, you know what I mean?
Well, on that note, it's been an honor, Musa and Scott. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We'll do a very quick break, 15 minutes. We'll move the live stream. I would just like to ask the panelists and the panel leaders to, when we return, to come into the front row, because drawings after the panel will open it into a circle for the round table, so that we don't have to shuffle that. Yes. Welcome back, everybody. So we will do the third panel on secular versus divine power. And then right away, we will open the first row where the other panelists and leaders are sitting, and we'll start the roundtable. It's going to be a completely flexible and casual conversation, which means that you won't have to raise your hand. We will just allow for questions as they arise, and have a lot of fun. Thank you for being here.
Okay, hi. So I'm Rebecca Lowe, and welcome to this discussion about power in the realm of religion. Delighted to be here with Jennifer and Shadi. I'm going to introduce them to you and then convene a flexible conversation between them in the context of their writing about these matters. But first, I'm just going to briefly talk about the structure I'm going to impose on this discussion, because I'm the most important kind of power, moderators. So I'm going to begin by asking their thoughts on what we mean when we talk about divine power and religious power, about what these powers consist in, where they come from, where, when, and how they're held and exercised, what their sources of legitimacy are, who's affected by them, and how we can know about them if indeed knowledge is a relevant concept. Then we're going to move on to the actual manifestation of these powers, and particularly religious power, so its role in the world today, in modern political society, and in times past, but also its ideal role, the role it should be playing. Its authority, its value. Or should they be manifested in society? But first, I want to introduce two very intellectually powerful people. We have Jennifer, sorry, I'm going to continue making those jokes. I'm sorry. We have Jennifer Frey, who is the Dean of the Honors College and Professor of Philosophy at the University of Tulsa. She's also a faculty fellow at the Institute for Human Ecology at the Catholic University of America, and a Newbigin Interfaith Fellow with the Carver Project. There's a little town called Newbigin. You're from in northeast England, so I'm glad that we have united on the importance of Newbigin. Her academic research focuses on moral psychology and virtue. She has a co-edited book called Self-Transcendence and Virtue. She's currently finishing up a book called Practical Truth, written with her husband and colleague, Christopher Frey. And she's got a third book titled Practical Wisdom, under contract with Oxford University Press. In 2015, she was awarded a multi-million-dollar grant from the Templeton Foundation titled Virtue, Happiness, and the Meaning of Life. So all the important stuff, she's your person. She also writes excellent popular essays and book reviews and hosts a podcast called Sacred and Profane Love, focused on philosophy, theology, and literature. So listen to her podcast. We also have with us Shadi Hamid, who's a columnist and member of the editorial board at the Washington Post, where he focuses on culture, religion, and foreign policy. He's also a research professor of Islamic studies at Fuller Seminary. He is also the author of several books, including most recently, The Problem of Democracy. His previous book, Islamic Exceptionalism, How the Struggle Over Islam is Reshaping the World, was shortlisted for the 2017 Lionel Gelber Prize for the best book on foreign affairs. And his forthcoming book on power, I mean, it's very popular. What's the chance? It's going to be published next year by Simon & Schuster. He also has a podcast and various other interesting things over at Wisdom of Crowds. So we've got a bit of competitive tension here, which he co-founded. So we're now going to turn to the powers that be, religious and divine. So first question is, I'm assuming a distinction between these powers. So I'm going to ask a little bit whether you agree with me on that, how you conceive of them. So if, for instance, a power is something like a capability that's held and exercised, then what does it mean to hold and exercise divine and or religious power? Who does it? What is it? And who does it affect? Jennifer, let's start with you.
Okay. Well, I just take divine power to be the power of God, right? So it would be good old-fashioned omnipotence, practically theist sense. And religious power is either going to be the power of those exercised within a religious institution. It's typically going to be hierarchical. We also might talk about the sort of power that comes through the individual participation in religion. So if you go back to sort of the classical sense of religion, it's a virtue, it's a praxis, it's connected to like meaning and happiness, and ends up being a kind of organizing virtue for people. Because if you look at thinkers like Cicero or even St. Thomas Aquinas, like they both think of religion, and religio of course means that which binds us together. They think of religion as the virtue that ordains all of your actions towards like the ultimate good, right? Both of them are thinking that has to be something supernatural. And then religious acts in particular, like tithes and sacrifices and stuff like that. So, but as to like how they're related, I mean, I suppose that you're only going to grant authority to some religious figure or religious institution that you think has some real connection to divine power, right? So I mean, my religious faith is Catholicism, and so when we're talking about the sacraments, you know, sacraments can only be enacted through priests, right, who have a power conferred on them through Christ. So it's like you have to have something like that that's sort of mediating too.
Excellent. So religious power kind of trading on the power of divine power.
I think it's gotta be connected if it's gonna have
Makes sense.
any kind of
Unless you're one of
weight.
those people who thinks you can worship Star Trek or worship secularism, you might just not say that's a religion.
Yeah, so I mean, we could talk about the sort of substitute kind of religious practices. I mean, Tara wrote a great book about that called Strange Rites. But that would like be getting to this question of, in absence of God being your final organizing end, is it Star Trek or the DNC or something else, right? And that would be, I mean, then it would be a kind of substitute religion, yeah.
So it's still going to be trading these days.
But I think you gotta cut the divine out of
That makes sense. Shadi, what do you think? Agree? Disagree?
Yeah, so I think that, well, my starting premise is that God exists, and if God exists, that would mean that He created us. And if He created us, that means He instilled into us a desire for Him. That, and you know, there's a lot of discussion about, you know, Catholics will talk about this desire being being ordered towards God is inscribed in our hearts, that whether or not we believe or not, we can't help but be affected by that because it's in us, it's inherent in the kind of human experience. So I think, I mean, that is a very, that's an immense power when you think about it that way. If it's something that is inherent and it's something that is contained in all human beings in one way or another, then that has major implications. It also makes me think of something that the book there is Sam Goldman, he talks about the law of the conservation of religion. And the idea there is that the religious impulse is constant throughout all time and place. The only thing that varies is how it's expressed. And that goes to something that I think we've been touching on over the last couple hours, is that even if we're not religious, that impulse is reflected in different ways. And I mean, I think it's pretty remarkable how, I mean, not everyone I know is like this, but the vast majority of people I know are like this. You do see this desire for the transcendent. There's something that is inside of them that is, it might not be leading them towards God, but leading them towards wanting something that feels like God or replaces God or substitutes God. And I think that's just inescapable in how we look at our politics today. That's also the power of secular ideologies. When people lose religion, they don't necessarily become these sort of rational, reasonable people who are just deliberating about the right policies to enact. People, you know, post-religious people can be very ideological and also very violent in their religious passions, if you will. And the story of the 20th century is a story of, I would say, in one way or another, religious desires being sort of transmuted into a kind of secular apocalyptic or secular messianism, whether we're talking about Marxism, communism, or Nazism. That's one of the reasons the 20th century was the century in which we lost religion, but also the most destructive century by far in human history. I don't think those two things are coincidental. They're not, I mean, it's very unlikely that they're coincidental. So, so if we take the premise that the religious impulse is something that's there, I think it has pretty profound political implications for like everything we think about and debate. And, you know, if you don't share my premise that we all have a religious impulse, then that leads to a different conversation. But I think empirically, when we look at human beings, I think it's very hard to escape the conclusion that we can call it different things. But there is a kind of, there is that something.
Yeah, I mean, this brings so many to this idea about, you know, we might, well, some of us might believe that there is such a thing as God, as divine power. But that doesn't necessarily mean we have access to it. I mean, I think Tara mentioned this earlier about the difference between believing that something is the case and having some kind of like epistemic access to this. So this reminds me a little, I was reading a piece by Jennifer earlier, and you had this nice line, you said something like, we can't fully capture concepts like the good, rather we can only inadequately approach them. So on some level, that feels like it might be in tension with what Shadi was saying, because if it's inside us, maybe we have some access to it. But actually, I think that wording, inadequately approach them, sounds a little like maybe you're saying actually is that right? Do you think this is?
Yeah, no, I mean, well, again, I mean, I'm sort of coming from a tradition of classical theism where, you know, good is another one of the names of God, and yeah, we don't understand God, right? I mean, we couldn't possibly, because we have finite conceptual categories that could not possibly contain God. But that doesn't mean that we can't say anything about God. And obviously much of the theological tradition is figuring out what you can say about God. So you know, think about like all of the negative theology, you know, we can say what he's not. And then that turns out to probably make some pretty positive claims. And then also, you know, all this stuff about analogy, like we can sort of try to approximate or understand things by analogy. And so we, you know, we can say that God is just, but understanding that that doesn't mean that like God needs to follow like United States law or whatever, because that would be ridiculous. You know, but just to follow up on something that Shadi was saying, you know, there's like tons of empirical data that human beings do yearn for the transcendent, right? That there's like some kind of deep-seated desire there. But I think a lot of people might question whether or not that's necessarily like religious in the sense that it's an inborn natural desire for union with God. A lot of people do argue that, for example, experiences of awe and wonder, which are like universal as far as we can tell, are an expression of that basic human desire for self-transcendence, but people who try to measure this, you know, show that you can get these beautiful experiences by like looking at a mountain, or even just distressingly like going to a Nazi rally, you know, like getting, you know, that's like off the charts in terms of self-transcendence. So I mean, there is something there, like for sure. And the question is, you know, how do we really understand it? Now, you know, I also believe in God and then the whole thing, but
the thing is, you don't even really have to believe in God to believe necessarily. Like, so
that we're all ordered to God?
No, in the sense that there's people who like convert to various religions and they're focused on doing the practice and doing the ritual, and and they might have doubts about whether God exists or not, but they see the ritual and the practice as maybe a way of opening up their hearts in the future. I was just going, so Honor Levy, she's a podcaster, maybe she's popular in New York, so you guys might know her, I don't know. But she's like this writer, podcaster person, and she converted to Catholicism recently. And one of her quotes, which stood out to me, she said some quote, "You do the rituals and then it becomes real, even if you don't initially believe in it." And then in the 19th century, there's another quote like this from the Christian philosopher John Ruskin. He was going through a state of inner torment, as a dark night of the soul. And then he wrote to his father in a letter that he wasn't sure if God was real or if there was an afterlife, but he would quote, he would act as if the Bible were true. And I think there's something really powerful there that you can almost will believe into existence. I wouldn't suggest that for everyone, but I think this idea of belief versus not believing is actually a little bit more nuanced, and different people approach religion or divine power in different ways. And it's not always through a very straight line of correct belief. I would say that.
Yeah. Well, and I would say also, I mean, people, I mean, it's the opposite for me because I'm a convert. So I had to like really believe something was there before I was ever going to go to a mass. But I also think that people who have been practicing a religion for most of their life, lots of people go through times when they have pretty significant doubt, but they still practice, and that still gives them a sense of being grounded, and lots of those people come back to a strong faith. But there is something, yeah. I mean, I think that need for ritual is pretty profound.
It's interesting, this is kind of meta question also about, my belief to really represent me, for it to be something personal, do I need to have control over my beliefs?
Yeah.
So kind of doxastic, voluntaristic debate. And actually in the recent piece, Shadi, that I was reading, you talk about this idea from Pascal that I kind of compelled belief in making them stupid. That said, I mean,
that was Pascal's view, not necessarily mine.
Sure.
Yeah.
But yeah, again, I suppose you come back, there are massive debates within philosophy about what kinds of things we need to have control over, for us to count as being free, for us to count as being something that is personal to us. But if it's the case, either this is just in us, or if it's the case that God in some sense is acting through us, then there is this tension, isn't there, with the idea that it's also a matter of personal faith, that it's a matter of coming to something. Is this a tension for you?
But I guess we can just bring it down to the secular, so even the fact that in the US today we talk about an epidemic of loneliness, mental health crisis, unprecedented rates of teenage depression, suicidal ideation, I think all of us intuitively know that something's not quite right. And I think that we can call it religion, call it something else, God or not God, but the fact that we need something more than what we have. In a sense, this is in some sense the best time to be alive, if you look at it from a certain perspective in terms of growth metrics and infant mortality and reductions in childhood poverty. Like if you look at the economic metrics, the US is still an incredibly vibrant, I mean, our economy is like pretty awesome compared to like in Europe, not so much, but like there is something special about the US in all of these different ways, yet we have profound levels of unhappiness. So as our economy grows and as we kind of eclipse other countries by wide margin, just in terms of economic growth metrics, that is when we're confronted with this crisis of faith, of meaning, of belonging. And that to me is not coincidental. We realize that even if we have a lot of what we thought we wanted, that's not enough. And, even you reach certain levels of material wealth, and a lot of us, we get what we want, or a lot of what we thought we wanted in our careers. And then we're faced with this question of like, this can't really be it, can it? And I'm going through, and I can talk more about that if it comes up, I guess, but I'm going through like one of those seasons of like, okay, this is not enough. Like, and so many of us aren't happy, or we're like happy in a very, very kind of like, we're getting along, we enjoy our lives to like one degree or another, but then there's this like yearning, and it's like, okay, what's next? And the fact that so many of us feel this, and all the polling on happiness or lack thereof, I think makes this pretty clear. So people are searching for something. They don't have to find it in God, but the fact that they're searching, I think, is illustrated here.
So this reminds me of your writing on happiness. You have quite an expansive notion of happiness, which goes beyond sort of subjective experience and has to track the good, objectively valuable things. This sounds like a meeting of minds.
Well, I mean, it just sort of reminds me of Augustine's Confessions and Augustine's Restless Heart. And, you know, Augustine was this guy who basically like, you know, all of his ambitions were satisfied and more. And yet and yet it's like he's dead inside. Or he's so filled with, there's a brilliant vignette in the Confessions where he's like on his way, because you know he's like Mr. Fancy speech maker basically for the Empire, which is a very good job. And he's on his way to give some big speech, and he meets basically like a drunken homeless person in the street, and he has this realization that like this guy is better off than he is. And of course this is like really alarming. Because he's so full of anxiety and like all this negative emotion. And at any rate, you know, he comes around to this idea of like, okay, but like what's ever gonna really satisfy me? You know, and then everything seems kind of wanting. Like it's not really gonna do it. I think that's a very common, I mean that was like me when I was 20, before I converted. And so reading Augustine at that point in my life was like, oh no, you know, like maybe this is like not gonna get better. But I think it does. I mean, regardless, you know, I force 18-year-olds to read the Confessions, not because I want them to become Catholic, but because I think that I think that they need to think about what would fulfill them, right? Like young people sort of connect with this. It's true to their experience, but it sparks this question: what is going to satisfy you? Like, do you know? And are you going for that thing? And why are you so confident that that thing is the thing that's really going to satisfy you? Given that you are who you are, and you know that is the question of what is your ultimate, like what are you ultimately going for? What are you ultimately hoping for? And that's just something that that's a question that like people need to reflect on. And what is so astonishing to me is they haven't, right? I mean, and it's not, I'm not knocking them. I love them and I was in the same position, but like they haven't. They've been trained to do that. And it doesn't matter if they're religious or not. Like they haven't really thought about what they ultimately hope for or want. And that is something that, you know, I think a good liberal education is going to equip them to do at the very least. Think about that.
I mean, but there is this whole like industry of happiness, which I think gets at a lot of these questions in a secular way. And I was struck when I started, I had a whole phase of listening to happiness podcasts. One of them is, well, the one by Laurie Santos, I guess, is one of the more famous. What is that called? The Happiness Podcast? Is it just called that? I don't know.
Probably.
Yeah, I guess people don't listen to that one. But you know, like,
Yeah.
and you know, and people like Arthur Brooks, you know, he's one of the happiness gurus. But like when you get into like Arthur Brooks, you sense that something else is going on. That he's almost like, I guess one way of putting it is that we write the books that we need to read. So anyone who's writing a book about happiness, the story is probably going to be a little bit more complicated. And this is one of the reasons that I write about questions around religion, meaning and belonging, because it's not just, you're not just the audience, like the audience is me, it's part of an internal dialogue where I'm trying to remind myself of what I think is important. And I'm trying to persuade myself of things that I think I already know, but for some reason I'm not always acting on them. And it gets to this question, I think, of, Augustine talks about this. There's basically two levels of want. One is wanting to want to be close to God, and then wanting to be close to God. And I think a lot of us have the former, but we struggle to get to the next level, which is the latter. How do we have to remove that intermediary want? And that's a very challenging thing to do.
Because it takes discipline.
Yeah, yes. Yeah.
Right? I mean,
Yeah.
Yeah.
But when I was listening to these happiness podcasts, I was struck by these sound like religion to me. Like we already know the answers to a lot of these questions. It's like religion stripped of the particularities of any given religion, but it's like, this is not new. And sometimes they'll acknowledge that. Nori Santos will be like, we'll draw on the ancient wisdom, and people back then, they understood things that we've lost sight of. So I think it's just interesting to kind of notice that. But the secular, even when we think about something like Soul Cycle, it just came to mind right now. Have you ever thought about where the name of Soul Cycle comes from? The word soul is in it. How did this happen? Yeah, so when people are just like cycling or whatever, it's supposed to do something to your soul. I guess that's the idea. But when we start to pay attention to the kind of the secular discourse around happiness and trying to be, living better, we find all of these like religious illusions. It's
I like this idea of like doing the hard work. I don't mean doing the hard work in terms of going to Soul Cycle. I mean doing the hard work, searching these things out. Not being like distracted by other stuff. I mean, Jen, in some of your writing, you talk about you wrote a great piece about what's happening in our universities and what might be needed, the hard work that might be needed to help for them to be a key place to kind of reorient us towards the good. You said fundamentally we need to reclaim the meaning and value of truth on campus before we can make any progress in facilitating intellectual friendship. I mean, reclaiming the meaning and value of truth is a big challenge, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, because a lot of people in our universities, including a lot of faculty, don't really believe in truth or get very suspicious when you talk about it. But I mean, look, we're not. If through our study we're not trying to get to knowledge, it's like, what are we doing? I mean, we should pack it up and go. But I mean, so sorry, I'm just like triggered by the happiness stuff. A lot of this like happiness, literature, but also this kind of popular media. I mean, it's some very thin gruel. I mean, I dated Dr. Santos, and I mean, it just turns out that all she means by happiness is a subjective psychological condition in which we can say you have more pleasure than pain. And I asked her, okay, well, I mean, imagine that I could just take a pill to manipulate myself into that state, or I get into Nozick's experience machine and like, virtual reality is getting really sophisticated, and I just program it so that I have all and only pleasures. Like, should I do that? And she basically was like, yes. And I'm like, okay, but that's not, yes, she did. And I was like surprised. I was like, okay, you bit that bullet. All right, well, I didn't think you were gonna bite that bullet.
Music isn't here anymore. I know. Meet the person who wants to go.
Yeah.
Genuinely.
Yeah, that's the danger of the thought experiment. You never really know where that's gonna go. But I mean, and I just, I was like, okay, well, I mean, we just don't mean the same thing by happiness. And I think that's like, part of my frustration with the current discourse on happiness, and frankly, a lot of the literature on happiness. I'm very annoyed with my fellow philosophers who tend to just like follow whatever the social science is saying. It's like, no, let's think about how this has been operationalized and whether or not that's like collecting data that we're actually interested in. You know, and there's been a lot of good work in philosophy trying to come up with a conception of happiness that's closer to the Greek concept of eudaimonia, just sort of like human flourishing. And what that recognizes is that human happiness actually needs to be deep rather than shallow. Because it needs to allow for the complexities of human life. For example, you know, a happy person still needs to make extraordinary sacrifices for the good. And that's not just like cutting against their flourishing, that's part of it. And the ways that the good is demanding and hard and difficult. So like, Wittgenstein famously said at the end of his life, he was not like a super happy guy. He was like, you tell him I had a wonderful life. Well, let's take him seriously, right? It wasn't just that it was all like, you know, oh, well, it's the hedonic calculus came out right. I'm pretty sure it didn't in his respect.
But he was suicidal also for much of his life. I think 3 of his brothers, or some crazy number, actually like committed suicide. So maybe he was being like kind of ironic.
No, I don't think I want to take him like prima facie seriously, because like people who were with him, you know, in his last days did. And, or, you know, set aside Wittgenstein and I'm a philosopher, just make someone up. Like we want to take that seriously and take seriously that you can have a flourishing life and have moments of doubt, moments of crisis. Like it's not, I think our models of happiness are far too simplistic, in which happiness like actually seems sort of vapid. And like we should go for something else. Like don't be happy, be like purposeful or something.
It's also like happiness as like avoiding being sad. That I think there's also the stigma against, if we're sad, we have to find ways to fix that as soon as possible. When, you know, we know in pre-modern times that sadness was a way of becoming closer to God. That's how it was traditionally seen.
Yeah.
That grief was something to be accepted and even embraced for periods of time. And, you know, we certainly have that in the Islamic tradition as well. Like our equivalent to Augustine is al-Ghazali, the great medieval Islamic philosopher. And he had a maybe somewhat similar situation where he had all this fame as one of the great Islamic scholars in Baghdad. And then one day he goes to teach his students, and he has hundreds of students who are kind of like hanging on every word. And then he finds that he is no longer able to speak. He's going to the lecture, but he finds that he's like paralyzed. And then he kind of like decides to leave Baghdad and goes into like a long period of solitude. And I was actually talking to someone here earlier who brought up maybe a similar idea that he had about leaving public life. And when he said that to me just a couple hours ago, I find that such an intriguing idea. Like that is actually something worth pondering. I probably won't do it. But this is something that our great sages in the past, they actually felt that they had this dark night of the soul. They were really in this state of grief and difficulty and wrestling with, do I feel God? And then their solution was to really like lean into that grief. And I think that's what religion is partly about. It's about befriending reality instead of trying to avoid reality. And we can get into like the whole kind of self-care discourse and therapy, which I think is very much based around like sadness. Like we don't want to be in that too much, and we want to fix that. And even when we have terms like the pursuit of happiness, is happiness something that we should pursue and search for, and we take steps to find happiness? That's also part of the problem. That the religion, like the pre-modern approach, was more that you do things that are meaningful, and then perhaps happiness will be a byproduct. But you don't start your day thinking, how do I be happy? And that's why it usually doesn't seem to work if it's something like, oh, I'm going to listen to all these happiness podcasts. I'm going to read Arthur Brooks's books or David Brooks's books, which are, probably good. They're good in different ways and helpful, but that's not going to make you that's not the way to approach happiness necessarily.
So I think in the context of this discussion about value of religion, how it might help us to find something perhaps deeper than happiness in a kind of thin sense. We touched on this a little before, but I think we've just got enough time to talk about, what is the state of religiosity in the world. So in your recent piece, Shadi, you've written about kind of competing views on this kind of standard modernization idea that as society becomes safer, there's more growth, more prosperity, then religion will die. On the other hand, this idea that religion is going through some kind of consolidation of growth, so particularly certain religions in certain places. And you brought up this term about the paradox of secularization, this idea that the more secularized a society is, the more noticeable the holdouts. Is this where you land on this question? I mean, you were describing these things mostly in your piece, although you made this beautiful conclusion at the end about what religion can offer us. But what do you think? I mean, if you were doing the social science thing and saying how religious is the world, that's just a small question.
Yeah. Okay. Well, look, there is secularization is real in the American context. In a lot of other parts of the world, Middle East, Africa, parts of Asia, you see, Latin America to various degrees, there is a kind of, you see religious growth in various different kinds of religion growing quite rapidly. But the US is a case where, we were hovering at around 70 to 75% church membership rates from 1930s until like 2002 or 2003. In the last 2 decades, we've just seen that fall off a cliff under 50%. So you have to ask yourself, and we were one of the holdouts along with Ireland. And so we're no longer the holdouts. Granted, we still have much higher levels of religious identification than like Western Europe, but that bar is just incredibly low. And so no one should be comparing themselves to Western Europe on those metrics. And I think there is also a concern that once you hit that tipping point of below 50%, it's very difficult to recover. And because there's spillover effects and network effects, and now not being religious is just so normalized that especially in educated or elite circles, and educational attainment has grown quite rapidly over the past 70 years, where a large number of Americans, something like 35% have a bachelor's degree, where not too long ago it was in the single digits. So in educated circles, religion is seen, or orthodoxy and or religion are seen with a skeptical eye. And I just going to be very hard to undo those effects. So I think we are living in a sort of secular future in America, but that means that religion will be more noticeable because religion is strange. It's especially in circles like ours, it stands out to people. And when I'm hanging out with, my friends in DC, I remember for many years, there was a sense of skepticism. Shadi, do you really believe that? Even though they're like my close friends and I've been talking to them, yes. And even to this day, I've been writing about hell more. I think the idea of hell is very useful to have for instrumental reasons. I think it's just good for us to have an idea of punishment, which I don't have to get into right now. But okay, fine. I'll just say very briefly, I don't want to live in a world where there isn't justice. And justice is only possible with punishment. And justice is only possible with hell. Like the idea that Putin or any number of Arab dictators or the Israeli army can get away with just like wanton killing and suppression of people. And then you're like, there's not going to be any accounting for this while we're alive. I don't think there probably will be in a lot of these cases. And I'm just not willing to live with that. And the idea of hell is a kind of bomb in that sense, because some people do deserve to be punished for very long periods of time. And there's an interesting kind of like Islamic and also Catholic debates. Is hell truly eternal? And that's an interesting debate on its own. But yeah, these things are just we have a need for the idea of justice. And I think the danger of seeing justice as something that is accomplished in the here and now, it leads to a lot of utopian political projects. If this is all you have, if your horizon is just in the next like 30 or 40 years that you're alive, and you want to have paradise on earth, because that's all that we can ever hope for, that can lead to a very destructive political impulse. So I think there's something very pluralistic and like, oh, to say, look, we're going to try our best while we're alive. We'll try to do good and to influence policymakers to not be so terrible on the issues that we care about. But it's going to be out of our hands. Well, we do the best we can, but the rest is up to God. And we're able to kind of like let go or chill to some degree. And we say, look, justice was not accomplished, but maybe there will be a greater justice in the next life. That's not the way religious people always think about this. I'll acknowledge that.
So I was going to ask this, so Jennifer, you've written religion is a matter of justice about what is owed. That's like, this struck me as like, but my question is, following what Shadi was saying, is in terms of divine justice, is punishment like constitutive of this? Is it part of it? Or is it separate? Is it an enforcement mechanism? Is punishment a part of justice, as you said? If divine justice is, if religion is a matter of justice, if it's about what's owed, is it separate to, or is it part of it?
Oh, well, just to contextualize, I said that, quoting St. Thomas, because, you know, the old-timey conception of religio as a part of justice was just that in religious acts and acts of worship, acts of tithing, acts of praying, oaths, etc., that we are trying to give back to God what is owed as creator of all being. Now, it turns out that's a debt you can never repay, so it's not real justice, but like there is a recognition of the debt that motivates religious acts. But in terms of divine punishment, I mean, I'm Catholic, I believe in hell, I also believe in purgatory, but I think hell is really about the absence of God, right? So hell, you know, purgatory is about purifying the soul so as to be united with God, and Catholics believe that's necessary. But hell is really just the absence of God. That is why, you know, there's no hope and there's no love in hell. And I think that, I mean, so for example, if you read like Dante's Divine Comedy, and unfortunately, like people will like typically like just read the Inferno, which is great. It's a banger. I get it, but in isolation, you know, it's a little bit misleading, right? Because you're sort of only seeing one side of it. But really, the thing about Dante's hell, which is so profound and provocative, and to me really compelling, is that in hell, people get what they really want. It just turns out to be awful, right? It's their desires stripped of all illusion and fantasy, and it's just, well, actually, that's you. And it's very terrifying, like once you realize that. And it's really just a reflection of who they are and not being fit for divine communion, but by choice, right? And so, yeah, I mean, I think that it is picking up on a reality. But you know, even secular people, and by secular I mean secular in the new sense of not religious, not in the old sense of worldly. But secular people are also profoundly moved by Dante's Divine Comedy and his fiction of hell, I think, because they are seeing that, at least that connection between, you know, the contrapasso and the life. And I think what people do with that, you know, is between them and the Lord, but I think it's like important to look at that and think about it.
Shadi, last word. So once I'm guessing then, we're probably coming close to the time, so
You want the last word?
sounds like a religious term. So.
Yeah.
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 Make a cocktail. It's a good cocktail.
Yeah, well, I mean, maybe just like a final reflection on, since we're just talking about hell, I think that gets into like a really interesting conversation about incentive structures. And yes, like, you know, I'm Muslim. In Islam, fear of hell should not be the sole motivator, and there's something beyond. Like when you have a higher level of spirituality and closeness with God, you do good because you seek God and you want to be closer to Him. But for a lot of people, we still need that basic incentive structure because we got to be realistic. A lot of people aren't going to be able to achieve those spiritual heights. So there's something very practical about religion, and maybe particularly Islam. I can't speak, you know, to the same way you can about Catholicism. But you know, at some level, I even think about myself. I can't claim to always be motivated by this desire for communion with God. Sometimes the fear of hell, because Muslims aren't automatically granted entry into heaven. Like we still got to contend with some difficulties. We could run into some trouble, even if we're Muslim. Like we don't have this idea of being saved.
Well, neither do we.
Yeah, sorry, it's true. Yeah, Protestant something here. Yeah, sorry. No, I just meant not Christian. I don't differ on this matter. Catholics, yes.
We go one.
Yeah, so you know, I think about myself. There have been times. So when people say, "Does fear of hell actually inspire better behavior?" There have literally been an endless number of times where I'm thinking about, okay, should I do this? And then it's like, okay, well, I don't want to cause too much trouble in like the afterlife. Like I know my like, you know, and people will be like, Shadi, do you really think about it in such like, come on, are you being serious? But yes, that is like a real thing. And I don't think there's anything like particularly bad about being motivated by like, we are human beings. We are responsive to incentive structures. We're responsive to reward and punishment. There's nothing like we shouldn't be ashamed of that.
So in the rite of confession, right, for Catholics, so we have to say an act of penance. And with that act of penance, it's the same for everyone. But we do talk about I'm sorry I've offended you because you're God and you're all good, but also because I fear the things of hell. So like it's there for us as well, right? Yeah, and maybe just like the last thing I'd say on this, like another thing that I think people look at very negatively when it comes to religion. And I remember people would say, well, oh, isn't religion just a crutch for the weak-minded? Or when I would talk about religion in this way, they'd be like, Shadi, come on, man. But like then I started to think about the analogy of a crutch. And we need crutches. Like if your leg is broken, there's nothing to be ashamed about in using a crutch. But then you might say, well, your leg isn't broken forever. But if you think about it, and maybe this is where some of the Christian influences on me might be apparent, but I am sort of enamored by this idea of humans we're broken by sin. There's a sort of inherent imperfection to us. And to come to terms with that, and if we're broken by sin, then what's wrong with having a crutch? It's not for the weak-minded. It's because there is something imperfect about us. We are weak, we are frail. And I think that there's something very like liberating about just being like, you know what? Like I fucking need a crutch right now. And for probably the rest of my life to different degrees, you know? Yeah.
Well, on the note of painful things and pleasure and pain in the afterlife, it strikes me earlier about Wittgenstein and happiness. So Wittgenstein famously got a lot of pleasure from going to see cowboy films. But my guess is he would have found much deeper happiness in being here discussing with us. Of course, he wouldn't have let any of us speak. He would have, from on high, commanded down and told us what the answers were. So, thank you so much, both of you, and
And then connect the audience. Yeah, as you feel comfortable. I think it takes time to be a little bit closer so we can hear you as well. We're using the camera mic. We're trying to move the camera a little bit. Yeah. First of all, thank you so much for this incredible panel. And so my job here will be to ensure that the audience gets, I think, your say, but also that the panelists of the different panels get a chance to reflect on each other's points. I think there have been some very interesting overlaps. I'd like to first ask about something that every time I do an event like this where there are multiple conversations, there's always something that we feel to be dancing around, but we never actually actively go into it. And I found that here, through these three panels on authority, on authoritarianism or fame, education, and then the question of religiosity. Whilst we were talking about power, I felt that we were also talking about certs. And I felt this kind of profound need to kind of bob up multiple times as we're talking about it. The service that we want to perform to maybe a famous person as a fan to reassure them of our loyalty, the kind of service we might traditionally expect from politicians. Do we get it? The service that we want to perform in some greater for some greater good. And so I would just like to throw this word in, service, and what that means after having listened to the panels, you guys.
Oh, sure. Carlos, can I just jump in and start the conversation? We can just jump in.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, during the break, I was actually talking about this point. I mean, I think what I was talking about in particular was I think the ways that a lot of the conversations about higher ed and academia go around is that they're focused a lot on things like our academic freedom and the rights of professors, but like the traditional social bargain is that there's this pairing where privileges come with duties, rights come with obligations, freedoms come with responsibilities, and so on. And I think, academics are really focused on the first half of the equation because, of course, we like our privileges and our freedoms and all of this. But I think we actually don't maybe give as much attention as we should to do people think that we're living up to the that we're conducting ourselves in a responsible way, that we're living up to the duties and obligations that we're entrusted with. I mean, a lot of us are literally public servants who work at. I work at Stony Brook University. It's a public university. I'm a civil servant. And I think this question is not one that I think a lot of academics really wrestle with in a meaningful way. I think one of the ways the conversation goes awry when we're bashing all of those people who come for our rights and obligations. If we're not holding up our end of the bargain, or if we're not perceived to be holding up our end of the bargain, then why on earth should we have these freedoms and privileges and things like this? And so, yeah, I mean, to my mind, this question of service, I think, is actually really interesting for understanding.
But if the politician is a public servant, having to serve the public, but then what will the public do with their desire to serve?
Well, I'll just give, so I'm the dean of the college, and so I had to work on what the graduation requirements of my college were. And I wanted there to be a service requirement. And I got so much pushback from faculty on this, and we're just like, that's just not the university's job, you know, we're just here for scholarship. And I said, look, here's the thing, like, we're an honors college, and yes, you know, we have this fantastic curriculum and we have these very smart students, but if we really are giving them a kind of formation, like an education, a true education, then we don't just want them to be thinking about what's true, although we want them to be thinking about that, but we want them to be thinking about how with their knowledge they can give back to the community. And so I did pass, it's now you have to do 80 you have to do a minimum of 80 service hours to graduate from the honors college, but it has to be direct service. And it has to be through one of our approved partners, because it's not just volunteerism. And our partners are all like domestic violence shelters and homeless shelters, and Tulsa Public Schools are some of the worst in the country. So lots of opportunities for our students to go there and mentor and tutor. And I really fought for this because I believe so strongly that part of what's going wrong with education in this country is it's all about the individual and the individual's excellence. And we're not asking these elites that we are producing, especially in an honors college, we are producing elites, to reflect over the course of their 4 years on how they can give back. And I think that is part of reaching their maturity and becoming like good citizens, which is what we're trying, you know. I don't believe that universities are just knowledge production factories. Like, we are forming the next generation of leaders and entrepreneurs, and we should be asking them ask them to think about how they are participants in a community and how their knowledge like can be used for the common good.
I think it's also that in academia, service is understood in a very technical way. So, those of you who are not in academia, if you go up for promotion, at least at my institution, you have a research section, a teaching section, and at the end you have a service section. And it's like, you know, the thing that doesn't matter. And I don't think, right?
The short, the three-legged stool, it's the stool that could take out that leg and the stool's.
To be fair,
Yeah.
teaching doesn't matter.
No, that also doesn't matter. So I always ask to teach the freshman class, the incoming 18-year-olds. I love teaching. And a lot of colleagues ask me, like, why are you doing that? That's a service class. It's called a service class. You know, like something you're not supposed to do. And again, you know, going back to your point, the problem with this is that we do not have this identity that we professors have moral responsibilities. You know, it's not just publishing and it's not just teaching, but we maybe have some kind of service. And that's present in all the issues, including the protests that were discussed today. Like, where are we professors acting as morally responsible people, mentoring, instead of just like, oh, here's your performance review with your publication list or whatever. Yeah.
I've got real.
And I think I'm curious that there's sort of two potential ways we might frame kind of a human hunger for service, human need for service. And I think where you go with it does sort of have a certain fire, just I think you can say. And I think Shadi and Jennifer touched on sort of one particular, perhaps religiously based or metaphysically grounded version of we have some kind of desire for the good or some desire for God, and that makes us want to serve in a certain way. But I think that whether or not you hold that, I think there's a sort of psychological component that can be unpacked, which is that we have some kind of desire to experience the feeling of usefulness. And that is something that I think, regardless of what is indeed true or what I think to be true, is something that can in fact be perverted as well. I think this is something that John and Joy brought up in your panel, that sort of insofar as the playing, like insofar as politics can be a site of the negotiation of unfulfilled or unfulfillable desires. One of them does, like one fantasy that can be sold is the like experience of feeling useful or feeling that one is of service, regardless of what is actually happening. I'm curious about how those things get disentangled, if indeed it is possible to do so.
Well, doesn't this, I think, this dovetails a lot with, Richard Reeves's work on boys and men. And one point that he always emphasizes is that men, for better or worse, need to feel that they're needed. And the fact that so many of them don't feel needed because they're no longer in marriages or no longer in families, that presents, just a huge social and political problem. But it gets to, I think, a broader point that you can only be useful in this sense in relation to others. And I think so much of our view of usefulness or happiness is basically privatized. It's so focused on the individual person and self-optimization and hacking your life that we lose sight. And Jennifer, you talked about this in your great Wall Street Journal review of books on having children, where you just made this point that, having children is hard, from what I hear. But it's worthwhile. And actually, like empirically, the happiest cohort in America among both men and women are married people with children. It's not even close. And I think that it's just fascinating how the empirical data tells us things that I guess would just otherwise be intuitive. Obviously, you're going to be happier if you're around people all the time, because you don't have as much opportunity to like sulk in your room and like ruminate and stuff. So, but that requires like, the reason it's hard for people, like less people are electing to get married and having children is because the view of happiness has to shift, I think, as you put it, from me to we. And again, that sounds like obvious. Of course, we should like make that transition from me to we, but it's actually pretty challenging in a society that valorizes the individual to the extent that it does.
This was what I was trying to get at. I'm sorry, thank you for your patience. Because if we posit and we do that, people have an inborn need for service, right? For wanting to be useful, for wanting to be communal, for wanting to be loved, for wanting to be part of something bigger, then I would love to hear from the professors here as well. And I also serve a community. What do you do when somebody approaches you or is near you, shows signs of this need? Because if through populism they are misdirected just to the loudest mic and not necessarily to the best idea, if the university no longer serves as the moral backbone that tries to create full humans upon graduation, and if these roads to religiosity are paved by incredulity by friends, like how come that how does it even work? And you kind of rush into this big wall of ignorance, then where does it go? It seems to me that it can only go to somewhere rather negative. And you wrote a whole book about these strange rights in some ways. What do people do when they have to reinvent the wheel? And it's not always nice. But let's go to somebody who's an expert on flourishing. Oh boy.
I'm skeptical about service. I actually created a construct in psychology. I measured it called pathological altruism. Barbara Oakley is an engineering professor who wrote about it. But I created the scale.
We have Laurie Summit-Farquhar here with Strangers Drowning. Some of you were here who wrote a whole book about this.
Yes, yeah. There's some terrific people in this field, but I've been trying to look at it, see how I have the test on my website, so you can find out where you are.
And I'm into taking.
Yeah, and it's interesting because you're score well in it.
I thought.
No, you're probably low. It's interesting because I think some of the worst atrocities in human history have come about in the name of service, moral superiority, and also just the feeling of I need to be needed. Like my mother, she like helps so much that you drown in her helping. You're like, no, I don't want any more food. It's like, she's like, I need to be needed. It's like, but what about the real felt needs of the other person, not your own egoistic. I mean, I love my mom. I recorded everything. I love my mom. She's such a loving person, but you can
Next, then we'll talk about Scott became psychotherapist.
Capability. So this concept of pathologic altruism is, I think, really fascinating because at the end of the day, I'm much more about being loved than doing love, and that's a big part of my book Transcend is this idea that we don't value the being of just like the personality of love and value that. Why do you have to check like all these things in a box to your service commitment? If you're a loving human, like that's service. And so I don't really understand that distinction. And one quick thing I want to say is I can't stop thinking about it. Your idea that the only reason why you do good is because you don't want to go to hell.
I didn't say only. It's one factor. Yeah.
Wow, I can't even wrap my head around that being a motivator. But so I genuinely want to understand your perspective. It's so different. Like in my view, like that's like the worst reason why someone would we have intrinsic motivation to want to help someone, right? It shouldn't be because we want to avoid punishment, but so your view is that that this could be like you would like us to teach this in schools, like hell should be taught in schools so that I can't say
It must be something in which like you don't do something that you would get pleasure from because you think it might cost someone else. You don't make fun of your friend even though everyone else is going to laugh because it's going to be painful.
But also your self-concept, your sense of self would suffer because you would say, I don't really want to live with the kind of person.
That's right, but sometimes it's hard, like particularly in the moment, to go into like your own sort of like balance. So you do consider like other people's.
Other people who read horoscopes in magazines believe in karma.
I want to just
have soft version.
I think that one problem I think the discussion is pointing to is, look, there are ultimate ends, right? We have different beliefs about ultimate ends, but what's important for what we do as intellectuals, as scholars, is not ultimate ends. There's eternal practices and there's being good and bad at those practices. That's what's important. I have my own religious views about what is going to happen to me and love and all that shit. But what's important to me is that, there's a tradition of writing and there's a tradition of doing history, and then these are practiced well and they're practiced badly. And I try to live up to the ideals of the tradition and do that job well. And that's not an ultimate end. That's doing my thing. And I think as Musa was saying, sometimes when people protest too much that they are actually pursuing an ultimate end, maybe you want to start to reach for your wallet. Like there's a certain type of moral certainty or self-righteousness that I don't necessarily, there's no universalizing because there are people who are very annoying and very good at their jobs. But usually I find that it doesn't happen that someone's extremely self-righteous about what they do has a lot to do with being excellent at what they do. That has more taking not themselves so seriously, but what they do seriously. And I think what Shadi said about al-Gharbi, who said about this moment where you had this panic, it reminded me of a book I read a long time ago called The Case for Irony by Jonathan Lear, where he talks about how people say, oh, there's too much irony and people don't take things seriously. No, opposite. As a matter of fact, irony shows a deep love, a deep taking seriously of the norms of your profession or your social practice to the point where you don't understand it anymore. You say, I take this so seriously that I sometimes have moments where I'm not sure what I'm doing or why it's important. I think, part of the confusion that we're discussing in terms of saying where does it come from, God or society? I think it's just look, you got a job or you have a practice. In our case, we have a practice. Very huge privilege to be able to do this kind of very free intellectual work. And you got to take that seriously and try to do it well. I have no idea if 100 years from now anyone's going to read my work. I would guess not. And I have no idea if it pleases God. It's not my business. I just think, you know, we all have our fields and we all have the thing that we do, and you have to do your best to do it. I think that discussions about final ends confuse the matter, and you know, you're better off just practicing your instrument than wondering if, you know, it's making God happy.
Can I jump in?
Yeah.
So one of the interesting things about this question about hell and negative consequences is like we have laws. We have laws that have punishments on, even from a purely secular point of view. And there's this narrative that people have that if it weren't for these laws, well, we'd all be raping and murdering each other, you know, left and right. But it turns out that when people are in the absence of those kind of formal rules, that's not the typical, the modal response. Actually, people tend to cooperate and tend to be pretty good, but it's not the case. But sometimes even good people need the law to keep them constrained. And then there are other times where there's just a small number of really bad people that can create great misery in society if it weren't for the law being there. So I think these kinds of negative visions, I mean, what are laws? They're basically saying if you do the wrong thing, you're going to go to jail or be executed or fined or something like that. And there's a role for that. There's a reason why almost all human societies have something that serves that role. I think even from a purely secular standpoint, without even folding in the religious thing. And so I think that's what I thought of when I heard the conversation about hell.
I think you don't.
Yeah.
We will go for like 2 more minutes and then.
Oh, I mean, he captured what I was just gonna say very quickly to Scott. You know, I don't think there's anything unusual again about negative consequences for bad actions. I think we have a lot of that in
If
secular.
I was God, it just doesn't make sense. Like psychopaths don't care about hell. Loving people, or the most loving people, are the ones that seem to care the most about. Oh my God, am I going to hell because they have a conscience? If I was God, I wouldn't arrange it like that.
Okay.
Yeah, but you're not. But you're not.
So deciding how his conscience works.
You're not God.
It's what works.
But it's also the case, you don't have to go on to the point around punishment. You just have to acknowledge that you have competing motivations. So I have like real moral problems with punishment. And I do also believe that there are genuine like moral imperatives and there are rights and wrongs in situations. But even if you know that, and even if on some level you know what it is, you've got these competing motivations. So sometimes it's not just a question of like, because you know what it is, you're going to do the thing.
Yeah.
You have to think about what the implications of doing the thing, what the consequences of doing the things. All of those are the factors. And those are reasons. The reasons in that, I mean, I'm an externalist for a reason, which makes me a crazy person, but I'm saying like, you know, there are things external to me beyond just me being motivated by the good. I don't have to get onto the domain of punishment. I just have to say, you know, the reason I don't punch him in the head, like, is partly because I'm thinking in mode, you know, he's annoying me, I want to punch him in the head. I know I shouldn't punch him in the head, but one of the things that make me not do that, beyond just the fact that I know it's wrong, is because it's going to hurt him. And the further one beyond that is punishment. But I think like you're missing the point around the intermediary thing. I can't just depend on the fact that I'm going to be automatically motivated to be good.
Well, nobody is.
Take into account these extra reasons. It's sufficient just that I'm motivated to be
But
good.
that's
I
okay.
should be.
I just also think we got to be frank, a little realistic, is that people's good things. I mean, not to be Machiavellian or whatever, but I think that two good things happen from low reasons. Like, you know, if you read the biographies of great artists who create beautiful things, this person's a fucking mess and they're a huge egomaniac, and they're not necessarily motivated by the highest principles all the time, but for some reason out of that come good things, and this is the nature of human existence. In like manner, a lot of moral, I believe, I'm enough of a Freudian and Nietzschean to believe this, a lot of people's impulse to punish or desire to see other people punished is not driven by their genuine belief in the moral good, but in their real, like in sadistic feelings or their own feelings of inadequacy. Yeah. There's no, in the process of interpreting for that for yourself, when you're actually, I have no idea if I get mad or if I think someone should suffer, if that's because I'm an agent of justice, or I'm just pissed off because they're did something that, I don't know, bothered me in some way. I have no idea. I can't make those kinds of self-interpretations. I mean, it's a lifetime of introspection, and you still get them. So I don't know. My feeling is there's very little you can actually accomplish in terms of your own spiritual life is your business, obviously, and there should be a culture that, but there's very little you can accomplish in coming to ultimate answers.
Business, but it like goes out in the world and affects other people. It's not just your business. I have a genuine question though, really genuine question, and I want to know your
I
answer.
hope it's really genuine. I'll give you, I can't promise a genuine response, but yeah. Okay.
What do you make of atheists who don't need that to do good? Like, how are they moral? Like, are they just some except like God created atheists to be like some special breed of human to lie to say they're not really like what is?
I think some people who are atheists have extremely deep, interesting inner lives that I'm like, wow, that doesn't really sound like you're an atheist because you're having some kind of weird conversation with somebody. And some people who say they're religious, I'm like, it really doesn't actually sound like you believe in God. It sounds like some very shallow and not, deep or humble attitude towards the world. It just sounds like you found some weird structure of self-justification. So I don't know. I think a lot of these labels are misleading. I think some people who are who claim to be atheists are actually very, kind of deep, and I would say maybe religious people. And I would say a lot of people who say they're religious are quite shallow and don't have deep inner lives. And I don't think that, and this is the problem is in our society, people apply labels to them and they think, oh, well, if I adopt this label, people will think I have a rich inner life. Well, you find out over time and what they put out in the world. But so I don't think any of these labels like atheist or religious are necessarily indicative of somebody who has the correct comportment towards life. You can see it in their acts.
Existence proof, though. There exists proof.
Yeah. Some people you're like, oh, this person. You could even say it to people. You can say it to people who are like, that guy's kind of a saint. Do they necessarily believe in God? No, but they have they have a certain attitude, a certain way of being towards others.
Thank you for your questions.
No, it's right. I think we're a little past in the conversation what I was going to say, but I think something that interests me then is, and I think going back to what you were saying, John, earlier about the importance or lack thereof of final ends is, I'm curious less of, I'm not curious about that. I am not in fact curious about final ends, but I think I worry that reducing conversations about religion to conversations about whether it's certain kinds of metaphysical knowledge that we probably, even regardless of faith, do not have access to, is overlooking something that I think is actually reminds me a lot of how you talk about your work, John, which is this, just now, which is the sense that there is a kind of an inherent meaningfulness to doing a thing well in a way that is hard, that is not perhaps for an immediate surface reward, that is not for a dopamine hit or it's professional success equivalent, but that there is something that is worth doing in and of itself without an obvious outcome. And I think a kind of wager on meaningfulness in this way, which is something that is, certainly has been written about by someone like Alistair McIntyre in a religious context as well as in secular context, is I think a kind of avenue towards some kind of realism that maybe does not, that can unite, let's say, people of traditional religious faith and people that might fall into your category, John, of the quote unquote atheist, where I do think that that dividing line is important. That there's some that you can call it realist or not realist. You could probably find a better name than I can come up with right now. But I think the idea that certain kinds of things are worth doing for their own
Intrinsic
sake,
motivation.
but it's to say intrinsic motivation. I don't actually think. Did it trigger?
Not trigger, but what? It sounded like you got.
Oh no, I wasn't mad. I just thought it was wrong. And the reason that I think it's wrong is that I think intrinsic motivation in the way that you're using it, the way it can be used, perhaps I'm misunderstanding you, could just as easily refer to a kind of psychological desire, affective desire. Like I'm like intrinsically motivated to do a lot of things that suck. Like I'm not very like, and I I mean, I don't think it's awesome. I find it very.
Like people who are just motivated to like put an effort, I think that's an awesome trait.
Oh.
That's all.
Oh, I see. That makes more sense. I think, yes, but I think that, first of all, that is not a universal trait. Secondly, I think that a lot of these, I don't know how intrinsic it is insofar as I think it's changeable. This is where the acts of faith as the faith will come language that came up in the third panel, I think is very useful, is that what is it to be intrinsically motivated is not necessarily to be innately motivated. And some, insofar as extrinsic motivation can change our intrinsic motivation ultimately over time, I don't necessarily find that framing helpful. And I wonder whether certain kinds of, whether it's education, moral conversation, like ways of being in society well, do over time help all of us, including those of us who, like me, are incredibly lazy, to reshape our instincts, which seems to be like one of the goods of both education and political life and moral life. And I think that I'm not sure how I mean, Shadi, I'm coming around on the whole thing. You guys, I think more than I can. But I think that this more broadly, I can this.
Mike is bad enough.
Alvin, let's just dialogue. Audience, yes, for sure.
Thank you all for the lively discussion. It certainly sounds like we've all, there's something construct here that the center of a lot of our souls. We've noticed a lot of people in the audience being like, and so I'm curious to, I'd love to bring it on a more personal level. What have you found? I think something I've been struggling with is, how do I trust myself? How do I trust my own inherent goodness? Like, I believe humans are inherently good, but I've done things that I regret. I've done bad things, and I have a lot of doubts about my motivations. I've had a savior complex, where I thought it was, I have a similar mother as you, Scott. And I'm curious. Exactly. So yeah, I'm curious, in your own experiences, in your own lives, you're all incredibly accomplished beings. I can see the care and the passion. What have you found about your own individual barometers? How do you rely on your own goodness? Is it avoidance of hell? Is it pursuit of something greater?
I think that
I don't rely on my own goodness at all. I mean, I think I just rely on God's grace. I'm not going to pretend that I'm a great person, but I think one thing that religious faith has done for me is to help me not give up on myself. So like, yeah, when I was a teenager, I was extremely accomplished and extremely sad and depressed. And just kind of like not understanding what the point of any of it was. And what I realized is that I don't have to trust in myself, that what I need to do is trust in God and God's grace. And that is how I try to live my life. And that seems to be going better for me than the alternative.
Sorry. That's I just want to drop the mic because you wrote a book about this basically from an not religious perspective, but one that is very intimately familiar to us, to culture and how we engage with these prime philosophical ideas. Do you have any notes on this?
Yeah, I don't think we can rely on our inherent goodness because I think that whether we're inherently good or evil or bad is kind of a different question. I come from an existential perspective, which suggests that we're creative beings. And so the existential project is for us to set goals for ourselves To be human is to stretch ourselves beyond the facts of our existence, beyond whatever, genes we're born with, whatever beliefs were instilled in us from an early age. And as we grow and develop, it's up to us to sort of stretch ourselves into the future and to take those, I guess, existential leaps. And life is so complex. We don't know, often we don't know in the moment whether what we're doing is good or bad or what the outcomes are going to be. But we have to live and make decisions and act and do things or choose not to do things based on so much incomplete information. And so what's important then is for us to remind ourselves to reflect on what we're doing, to be critical thinkers, to be philosophers of our lives, so that, after we've done the thing, we're like, oh, I made a mistake, I fucked that up. And so it's like, okay, well, what does that tell me about who I am and who I want to be and how I want to relate to other people in the world? And so we course correct. And so I think that's an alternative to, say, a religious perspective where it's like you trust in God. I think we can trust in ourselves as humans and as engaged beings without that.
So I feel even more strong. I agree with you. I think I feel even more strongly. I feel like it's one of my prime obligations as a human to use my capacities, my human capacities, to try to do well, to try to improve myself. This is one problem I have with the idea that God has a plan for me, or indeed I can rely on God's grace, and then I will do good things. I'm aware I don't always do bad things. One thing I really struggle with, actually, to your point, is I love eating meat. I love eating meat. I love cooking meat. But I'm really convinced that eating meat is moral bad for various reasons. Not even if all of the factory farms went away and animals had the best possible lives, best possible deaths, I think it's disrespectful, deeply disrespectful to eat the dead bodies of other living creatures. Still do it. I'm getting there. I'm really getting there. It's taken me like such a long time. One of the reasons that I struggle with this so much, not just because I think it's bad, really, really bothers me that I would do something that I know. I would go as far as, I'm mostly, skepticist about knowledge and stuff. I would say more than I know almost anything else. I know that it's wrong to eat meat. Yet I do it because I like the taste of it. Bloody hell. This is a deep moral failure. What other things would I do because they give me pleasure? Yeah, I'm a moral and political philosopher. This bothers me. And I feel like my deep obligation is to improve myself to this end. I can't just rely on, what someone else has in mind for me.
But the problem here is I feel like a lot of this ends up being very self-directed. How can we trust our own support? We think that we have a moral intuition. How do we know it's true? How do we trust it? And the way we've been describing it, it's like a very heavy burden to carry, these unlimited choices that we have. We're always making choices about how to live. And without having some kind of external authority to anchor us or to ground us in relation to something other than ourselves, it just seems like a very individualized, self-contained project. And this is why when people say live your truth or be yourself, that's usually bad advice. You shouldn't necessarily live your truth or follow what if your intuitions are wrong or bad? You shouldn't necessarily follow them. And maybe you shouldn't be yourself because you're not actually a good person. And this is why I think there's a lot in the kind of modern.
It doesn't have to be intuition. It can be using your basic human capabilities. And there doesn't have to be a God to be objective moral truth. Objective moral truth.
But how do we know?
So it's not what's good or true for me. It's what can I use my, whether you want to say God given, nature given, or whatever, my faculties as a living, reasoning, thinking creature to work out how to orient myself towards objective moral truth. I don't need to be a God.
I want to raise another aspect to this because, Julia, you guys study some of the worst atrocities that humans have ever committed as a job, right? So you're constantly subjected to, if I'm trying to decide if I'm good, I might compare myself with other people. If what I see is that other people are capable of horrible things, will that reflect back on me? And I'm really curious whether just being there in those moments with people and studying them changes your views on politics.
Such a good question.
Because you also study heroism, right? And there's the other
Yeah, my new project is on academic courage, actually. On finding in yourself this kind of, okay, so there is a high tension moment yet, let's say on the campus, and things are falling apart, and do you have the courage to send an email to a professor who has a very different point of view than you have and say, let's have coffee, let's discuss this, let's talk it through. And it takes courage to send that email, and it takes courage to say yes. And then actually that. So I do have a lot of interest in that. But going back to your question, I think it is really important to say that no matter what kind of accomplishment you have, there is still questioning, like you still ask those questions. And to me, two things helped. One was age a little bit, like growing a little bit older. And the other one was having a kid, right? So on the day when I had a New Yorker profile on my work, and I thought, okay, this is the moment when I can be like, relax. My kid spent 30 consecutive minutes, he was born in the US, doesn't have an accent, to teach me how to pronounce Thursday. And I was actually, I incorrectly pronounce things still, right? And it's much grounding. Yeah. You can have a New Yorker profile, you still can't pronounce Thursday.
Yeah, life and having a partner, having children, important for in so many ways for this. For one, your kids don't really care about, like, you can be a big deal in places like this, but my kids don't really care about. Like the one time, actually, the guy who played SpongeBob, who played Mr. Krabs on SpongeBob SquarePants, tweeted out one of my articles, and this I was like cool for 2 seconds for my children. But this act of, but also, having, there's this kind of, when I was the part of the intellectual journey I've been, is I used to think that constraints were nonsense, and that more freedom is good, more choices are good, more responsibilities are good. But first, I mean, there's actually a lot of empirical research that's just people actually don't like. They like to have choice, but not infinite choices. So like, and they like to have variable like decisions, but not like so. If we want mayonnaise in the store, we don't want 5,000 options for mayonnaise. We also don't want one. Like 5 is good. And we also don't want it to be the case that one mayonnaise can heal our cancer and the other one can kill us and the other one is good on potato salad, right? We want like relatively narrow risk for our choices. We actually don't like huge variety and risk. And so, one nice thing about being married and having kids is that, for one, I can't just give up if things are bleak, because I have people who depend on me, people who look up to me. And so you have to keep going. And it actually constrains me in a lot of ways, the kind of life structure I have now in terms of what I can do, what I can't do, in a way that actually enabled me to do more than I would have been able to do in the absence of that structure. So I'll give a quick example. I had a friend of mine who came to visit me on the Upper West Side. We grew up in the same small town in Arizona. And he was overwhelmed by the kind of quality and variety of women on the Upper West Side, which is very different than our experiences in we grew up. Okay. And the thing is, if I had come to Columbia and I was still a single young person, I think sorting out my dating and mating prospects would have occupied so much of my time and effort in all of this. I probably wouldn't have been able to do a lot, like I probably wouldn't have accomplished a lot of the things that I actually accomplished. But the fact that I came to Columbia when I was already an old man with children and a wife allowed me to come here and actually do the thing that I was like to do. Well, no, this is the fact that I'm married and I'm the ability to do this.
Yeah.
I mean, even the motivation, if it was just me, I could sit in the studio apartment and eat white rice every day, like with 2 plants somewhere, maybe.
Somebody compared being married to getting tenure.
Well, I don't know, speaking as a bachelor, I don't know if that's something else. But I think that, like, for me, and this is somewhere in between the existential self-actualization route and the religious route, is like, important thing in life is to avoid despair. Like, you can, like, life is basically just a struggle against despair. And
Have you met startup founders?
No.
Struggle toward.
Yeah, towards despair. A lot of people are struggling towards despair. And I think that like that's the opposite of that is obviously faith. Now, some people have a more religious or secular conception of that, but something that you're doing is worth it, is going to, your life is going to change. You know, like something can make an impact, positive impact. That's just basically like what life, to me, what life is just trying to like, and yeah, it's a fight, but you can't, and you're gonna have moments where you succumb to that. And I think, you know, from certain Christian thinkers like Kierkegaard, like he just defines sin as despair, which is a feeling that you actually can't change yourself, can't get out of this state of sinfulness or being stuck. So, I mean, sometimes ruminating on one's own wretchedness, although it's important to do it sometimes probably to straighten yourself out, is not the most productive, you know, I think, yeah, also there has to be a balance between self-reflection, which can overwhelm you and your life can be given over to self-reflection and it's not really an activity, and actually doing something and then you reflect on it later. So there has to be a balance between action and self-reflection in every human life, I think. And some people do too much of one or the other. But yeah, I think that those are the things I try to use to orient my life. I would say in terms of moral things, you know, it's usually that in my particular life, it's usually about hurting people because, you know, most of my activities are, you know, I worry about, did I do something hurtful to somebody I love or somebody who I ought to care about, who I should, you know, not mistreat, you know, those things preoccupy me. And usually you could talk to those people and find out if you did and if there's something you can do to change it. So, you know, sometimes it doesn't always go up. Yeah.
We're going to stop here because
Okay.
I'm going to summarize what life is. First of all, so we're sleeping and there's food outside. We will move all the conversation, all the questions to the outside part. We have about an hour in the building, so use it well. And then everybody's welcome to follow us to somewhere in New York City, maybe the Upper West Side. Thank you so much for being here. All the points. I look forward to continuing outside. And to my team.
Thank you.